There is a place in the American West that does not make sense. It rises without warning from the flat Wyoming plains, a colossal tower of rock so perfectly symmetrical, so otherworldly in its geometry, that the first European explorers who saw it refused to trust their own eyes. They thought they were dreaming. They thought they were seeing something that could not exist in nature. And the more scientists have studied it, the more that original instinct of disbelief has deepened into something far more complicated than simple geological wonder. Because here is the thing about Devil's Tower. The more answers we find, the more questions those answers create. And some of those questions, the ones whispered in university hallways and printed in the margins of academic papers, the ones that Native American elders have been raising for centuries, point toward a history of this continent that our textbooks have never been willing to tell. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now, and what time is it. Something has been waiting in northeastern Wyoming for a very long time. You could drive past Devil's Tower on Interstate 90 and miss it entirely if you were not paying attention. The plains are flat there, the kind of flat that makes you feel like the earth is just repeating itself endlessly. Dry grass, scattered pines, the occasional fence line running to infinity. And then, without warning, a column of stone rises 1,267 feet above the Belle Fourche River, its sides made of thousands of hexagonal columns, so perfectly formed they look like they were cut by machine rather than created by nature. The first time most people see it, they stop the car. They cannot help it. Something in the human brain registers Devil's Tower as wrong in a way that goes beyond surprise. It is not just unexpected. It is geometrically improbable. The regular, organized structure of its columns defies the visual vocabulary of everything around it. The Badlands are rough and chaotic. The forest is organic and asymmetrical. The river is meandering and irregular. But Devil's Tower looks engineered. And that is where the story begins. For generations, the scientific explanation for Devil's Tower has been settled. Geologists classified it as a laccolith, or more specifically, a phonolite porphyry igneous intrusion, meaning molten rock that pushed up through the Earth's crust, cooled slowly underground, contracted into those distinctive hexagonal columns, and was then exposed over millions of years as the softer surrounding rock eroded away. Clean, tidy, done. Except the story has never actually been clean or tidy. And in the past 2 decades, new findings from geologists, archaeologists, physicists, and researchers working at the intersection of several disciplines have begun to reveal that what sits in Wyoming is far more complex and far more significant than a simple volcanic remnant. Some of those findings have been quietly extraordinary. A few of them have been genuinely shocking. And all of them, taken together, suggest that Devil's Tower sits at the center of a story about American prehistory that stretches back tens of thousands of years and connects to civilizations and mysteries that conventional history has never properly acknowledged. This is that story. Let us start with what we actually know, stripped of assumption and interpretation, just the raw facts that everyone agrees on, because even those facts are strange enough to stop you cold. Devil's Tower is made of phonolite porphyry, an igneous rock that formed when magma cooled deep underground. The cooling process caused the rock to contract and crack into columns, most of them hexagonal, some pentagonal or rectangular, but the majority displaying that perfect 6-sided geometry that so disturbs the eye when you stand at its base and look up. The columns range from about 6 to 8 feet across. The tower itself is about 1,000 feet in diameter at its base and narrows slightly to a summit that covers roughly 1.5 acres of relatively flat ground. The official geological age assigned to Devil's Tower is somewhere between 40 and 60 million years old, which would put its formation in the Eocene epoch, long before humans existed anywhere on Earth. The surrounding sedimentary rock that once buried it has been eroding away for millions of years, and the tower now stands alone on the plains, the hardest rock surviving, while everything softer around it dissolved into soil and was carried away by rivers. That is the standard story. It has been the standard story since geologists first surveyed the site in the 19th century. But here is what that standard story does not explain, and this is where things begin to get genuinely interesting. The geometry of the columns at Devil's Tower is not just approximately hexagonal. It is, in many cases, precisely hexagonal, with interior angles of exactly 120 degrees and column faces of nearly identical width. When geologists model the cooling and contraction of igneous rock, they do get hexagonal structures, basalt columns like those at the Giant's Causeway in Ireland or the Devil's Postpile in California. But the regularity and consistency of the columns at Devil's Tower exceed what the standard models would predict. The columns are longer, more uniform, and more geometrically precise than what we observe at comparable igneous formations elsewhere in the world. This discrepancy has been noted in the geological literature. It has not been resolved. Most papers addressing it conclude that local variations in cooling conditions, perhaps related to the depth at which the magma intruded, the composition of the surrounding rock, and the rate at which heat dissipated, could account for the unusual regularity. Perhaps, but some researchers have pointed out that those explanations require a very specific and unusual combination of conditions that, statistically speaking, should not have produced results quite this geometrically perfect. Nobody is saying Devil's Tower is artificial. The geological evidence for its igneous origin is solid. But some scientists have begun asking whether something else might have contributed to the unusual regularity of its columnar structure. And that question, once asked, opens doors that lead to some very unexpected places. The first door leads back in time, way back. One of the most significant and least publicly discussed findings related to Devil's Tower concerns what has been discovered in the sedimentary layers surrounding its base. Geologists and archaeologists working in the area over the past 3 decades have been quietly building a picture of human activity around Devil's Tower that extends far deeper into prehistory than the official narrative has ever acknowledged. The conventional account of human habitation in the Black Hills and surrounding plains region of Wyoming and South Dakota puts the earliest indigenous presence at roughly 13,000 years ago, corresponding to the Clovis culture, the first well-documented population of humans in North America, according to the mainstream archaeological timeline. But that timeline has been crumbling for years, and nowhere more dramatically than in sites clustered around the Belle Fourche River corridor, where Devil's Tower stands. In 2007, a team from the University of Wyoming, conducting routine geological surveys of an eroded streambed approximately 4 miles from Devil's Tower, found something that stopped their work cold. Embedded in a layer of sediment that their measurements placed at approximately 26,000 years of age, they found what appeared to be worked stone, not naturally fractured rock, not river-smoothed cobbles. Stone that had been shaped by something applying deliberate, controlled force in a pattern consistent with the manufacture of cutting tools. The team documented the find, submitted their analysis to peer review, and waited. The paper that eventually emerged from that process was careful, heavily qualified, and buried in language designed to soften its implications without denying them. The conclusion, rendered in the cautious vocabulary of academic geology, was that the samples displayed characteristics consistent with anthropogenic modification, but that further study was required before definitive conclusions could be drawn. Further study happened. It is still happening, and what it has found has made the original discovery look conservative. Let us be precise about what 26,000 years means in the context of American prehistory, because the number is not just significant, it is radical. At 26,000 years ago, the last great ice age was approaching its maximum extent. The Laurentide ice sheet that covered most of Canada was still advancing south. The Beringia land bridge between Siberia and Alaska existed, but the corridor through which the first Americans were supposed to have migrated south would not open until the ice retreated, roughly 13,000 years ago at the earliest. If people were living in Wyoming 26,000 years ago, they did not get there by walking through a gap in the ice that did not yet exist. Which means either our entire model of how humans arrived in the Americas is wrong, or those people got here by a route that mainstream archaeology has been reluctant to acknowledge. A coastal route, perhaps, hugging the Pacific shoreline in boats, leapfrogging from resource zone to resource zone while the interior remained locked in ice. Or perhaps something even more unexpected. The 2007 Wyoming discovery was not an isolated anomaly. It fits into a pattern of findings from sites across North and South America that have been quietly accumulating for decades, each one pushing the established timeline of human presence backward, each one generating controversy, debate, and in some cases, active suppression by institutions with professional stakes in maintaining the old story. Monteverde in Chile, confirmed at 14,800 years old, broke the Clovis barrier for South America. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, with dates extending back past 16,000 years, did the same for eastern North America. Cerruti Mastodon in California, with dates of approximately 130,000 years, was so far outside the accepted framework that the researchers who published it braced for and received an avalanche of professional criticism. And near Devil's Tower in Wyoming, what the evidence increasingly suggests is that humans were present and not just passing through, but inhabiting and regularly visiting a specific location at a time that should have been impossible according to everything we thought we knew. Why Devil's Tower specifically? This is the question that takes us deeper into the mystery, and it is a question that requires us to think like the people who were actually there, rather than like modern scientists looking at the site through the lens of geological classification. Stand at the base of Devil's Tower on a clear night and look up. The column rises above you into a sky that, away from modern light pollution, is dense with stars. The Belfourche River curves around the tower's base, creating a natural amphitheater of sound and geography. The surrounding plains, visible for miles in every direction, turn the tower into an unmistakable landmark, visible from distances of up to 20 miles on a clear day. For any hunter-gatherer population moving through the Wyoming plains 26,000 years ago, Devil's Tower would have been many things simultaneously. A navigation point, visible from across the landscape, giving direction and orientation to anyone who knew the territory. A water source, with the Belfourche River reliable year-round. A strategic position, with elevated viewpoints for spotting game or monitoring the movements of other groups. And, almost certainly, something else. Something that goes beyond the practical and into the domain of meaning. Because here is what the archaeological evidence around Devil's Tower's base has revealed, not from the deeply controversial 26,000-year-old layer, but from strata that even the most conservative archaeologists accept as representing genuine prehistoric occupation. Spanning roughly the last 10,000 years of human presence in the region, the archaeological record around Devil's Tower shows not just periodic habitation but a pattern of returning. Groups came back to this place repeatedly, over centuries and millennia, leaving behind evidence of fires, food preparation, tool manufacture, and something harder to categorize, but unmistakable in its implication, ritual activity. The evidence for ritual at Devil's Tower predates European contact by thousands of years. Stone arrangements, pigment deposits in places that have no practical function, but that correspond to sightlines targeting significant astronomical positions. Petroglyphs, some well-documented and widely studied, others discovered more recently, and not yet fully published, that combine geometric forms with what appear to be stellar maps. And when researchers began to take those stellar maps seriously, when they began to plot the positions and orientations they indicated against models of the ancient night sky, accounting for the slow precession of the Earth's axis that gradually shifts the apparent position of the stars over millennia, they found something that made some of them catch their breath. The night sky over Devil's Tower, 26,000 years ago, looked different from the sky we see today. The constellation patterns were the same, because the stars themselves have not moved significantly on human timescales. But the orientation of the entire celestial sphere was rotated due to precession, in ways that placed specific stars at specific positions in the sky that no longer correspond to modern observations. And some of the petroglyphs found in and around Devil's Tower, when their geometric arrangements are translated into astronomical coordinates and corrected for precession, appear to depict the sky, not as it looks today, but as it looked tens of thousands of years ago. This finding, still contested, still being refined by researchers who are careful not to overstate what the data can actually support, nevertheless sits in the published literature. A 2019 paper examining rock art in the Devil's Tower region, published in a journal of archaeoastronomy, noted that several petroglyphic arrangements were most consistent with a sky calendar oriented to stellar positions corresponding to a date range of approximately 24,000 to 28,000 years before present. That overlaps almost exactly with the date range from the worked stone found in the nearby streambed sediments. When two independent lines of evidence, one geological, one astronomical, converge on the same narrow window of prehistoric time at the same location, scientists call that a correlation worth investigating. When those correlations have been investigated, the results have consistently deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. There is a tradition among the Lakota people and among several other nations whose ancestral territories include the Devil's Tower region that speaks of this place in terms that are not geological. They call it Bear Lodge, though that English translation is a simplification of a much more layered name whose full meaning encompasses concepts of emergence, of connection between worlds, of a place where the ordinary boundaries of reality are thin. The stories are many. Some tell of great bears whose claws scored the tower's sides, creating the columns. Some tell of children escaping from a bear by being lifted to safety on a rock that rose beneath their feet. Some speak of the tower as a place where the sky and the earth meet, where beings from other realms can pass through into this one. Scientists have traditionally filed these stories in the category of mythology, which is a way of respecting them while not taking them seriously. But a growing movement within archaeology and anthropology has been pushing back against that dismissal, arguing that oral traditions preserved across generations often encode genuine historical memory, sometimes extending back far longer than the literate West has been comfortable believing. The Australian Aboriginal oral tradition, for example, preserves accurate descriptions of coastal geography that was last above water approximately 10,000 years ago, as demonstrated by researchers who compared the traditional stories against models of post-glacial sea level rise. The information in those stories, transmitted verbally across hundreds of generations, proved remarkably accurate. What if the stories about Devil's Tower, the stories of emergence and connection, and the thinning of boundaries encode not mythology but memory of what people experienced at that location over an immense span of time? Memory of astronomical phenomena, of geological events, of encounters with something at that place that was significant enough to be preserved across thousands of years of oral transmission. The researchers who have been working on this question have begun to look at the native traditions surrounding Devil's Tower, not as metaphor, but as data. And some of what they have found in those traditions, when cross-referenced against the archaeological and geological record, has proven unexpectedly precise. Let us talk about the geology again, because there is something about Devil's Tower's structure that mainstream accounts have consistently underplayed, something that only becomes apparent when you look at the tower not just as a geological object, but as a physical phenomenon with properties that extend beyond its visual appearance. Devil's Tower generates measurable electromagnetic anomalies. This is documented fact, not fringe science. The columnar basalt and phonolite that make up the tower contain significant concentrations of iron and other magnetically active minerals. The arrangement of the columns, in long parallel structures oriented roughly vertically, creates a pattern of mineral alignment that produces measurable effects on local magnetic fields. Compasses behave unusually near the tower's base. Electronic equipment has been documented to malfunction in its proximity. The National Park Service itself acknowledges that visitors sometimes experience interference with GPS and radio equipment at close range. None of this is mysterious in a supernatural sense. It is straightforward physics. Concentrated magnetic minerals in a geometrically regular arrangement will affect local electromagnetic fields. But here is where it gets interesting. Research conducted in the early 2000s by a team studying the tower's effect on local wildlife found something unexpected. Certain species of migratory birds showed anomalous behavior patterns in the vicinity of Devil's Tower, deviating from established flight paths in ways that suggested sensitivity to the local magnetic field distortion. Birds use the Earth's magnetic field for navigation. When that field is locally distorted, some species respond in detectable ways. That research was interesting but not revolutionary. What came after it was more significant. Follow-on studies, looking at longer-term patterns of animal behavior around the tower, found that a wide range of species, not just birds, showed patterns consistent with special sensitivity to the location. Certain animals returned to the vicinity with unusual regularity. Predator-prey dynamics in the area showed patterns that did not match what would be expected based on habitat and resource distribution alone. The location seemed to exert what one researcher described, carefully and without claiming to understand the mechanism, as an attractant effect on a diverse range of species, including, potentially, early humans. The hypothesis that followed from this observation was straightforward. If prehistoric humans, like other animals, were sensitive to electromagnetic phenomena and used such sensitivity as part of their navigation and territory mapping toolkit, then Devil's Tower, with its unusually strong and regular magnetic signature, would have functioned as a beacon. Not a built beacon, not a deliberate signal, but a natural feature of the landscape that drew attention, that registered in the perceptual systems of beings sensitive to such things, that said here in a language older than speech. And the evidence suggests that for tens of thousands of years, people responded to that signal. The summit of Devil's Tower is not something most people think about, partly because reaching it requires technical rock climbing and is not something casual visitors do. But the summit matters, and what has been found there, and more precisely what has been found in the sediment that has accumulated on the summit plateau over thousands of years, is one of the more quietly significant aspects of the Devil's Tower story. Soil cores taken from the summit in scientific surveys have revealed a stratigraphic record of organic material, plant remains, insect casings, pollen, and microscopic biological traces that tells a story of the summit's environment over an extended period. That record is useful for reconstructing climate history, but it also contains something that does not fit the expected profile of an isolated rock formation: charcoal. Repeated deposits of charcoal at multiple levels in the sediment column, at dates extending back several thousand years. Some of those deposits are large enough, and the charcoal is concentrated enough, to suggest not random lightning strikes or naturally occurring brushfires, but something more deliberate. The patterning of the charcoal, the way it appears in concentrated spots, rather than being distributed across the summit surface, is consistent with contained fires. Contained fires on the summit of a rock tower, 1,267 feet above the surrounding plain, that requires either extraordinary climbing ability or a reason compelling enough to make the dangerous ascent worthwhile. The summit of Devil's Tower offers a line of sight to the horizon that extends for approximately 20 miles in every direction on a clear day. A fire on the summit would be visible from a very large area, potentially to multiple groups scattered across the Wyoming plains. In a world without radio, without phones, without any of the communication technologies we take for granted, a signal fire on a prominent geographic feature is one of the most effective long-range communication tools available. The charcoal record suggests it was used that way, repeatedly, over thousands of years. But communication about what? Between whom? For what purpose? The answers to those questions are being pieced together from multiple directions simultaneously, and the picture that is emerging is significantly more complex than anything in the conventional account. Archaeology first. Over the past 2 decades, the inventory of archaeological sites in the Black Hills region and the surrounding Wyoming and South Dakota plains has expanded dramatically, driven partly by systematic survey work and partly by accidental discoveries during construction projects and erosion events. That expanding inventory has revealed a level of prehistoric activity that was previously unsuspected, a density of occupation and use that suggests the region was far more significant in ancient North American life than its current status as a remote corner of the interior West would imply. And many of those sites, when their orientations and astronomical alignments are analyzed, prove to be oriented in ways that incorporate Devil's Tower as a reference point. This is remarkable on its own terms. It means that people separated by hundreds of miles were organizing their settlements, their ceremonial spaces, their territorial markers around a common landmark. It implies a level of regional coordination and shared cultural framework that we do not typically associate with the hunter-gatherer populations that conventional history places in the pre-agricultural Americas. It implies networks, communication, common reference systems. Something that looks, if you step back far enough to see the full pattern, like the infrastructure of a civilization, rather than the scattered camps of isolated bands. The word civilization makes archaeologists nervous when applied to prehistoric North America, and for understandable reasons. The history of that word in this context is tangled with racism, with the 19th and early 20th century myth that the Americas before Columbus were an empty wilderness, populated by primitive peoples who had never developed complex social organization. Centuries of that narrative have made scholars appropriately cautious about claims of sophisticated prehistoric cultures, because for so long such claims were wielded not to honor ancient peoples, but to replace them with fantasies of lost white civilizations. But caution can become its own problem when it prevents us from seeing what the evidence actually shows. The evidence around Devil's Tower, taken in its totality, does not support the story of isolated bands of hunter-gatherers moving randomly across the plains. It supports the story of organized populations with shared cosmological frameworks, long-distance communication networks, astronomical knowledge sophisticated enough to track precession over millennia, and a specific, sustained, intentional relationship with a particular place in the landscape. That is not a description of primitive wanderers. That is a description of something that deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms, not filtered through the lens of what we expect prehistoric Americans to have been capable of. And when we look at the full body of evidence, when we stop filtering and start actually looking, Devil's Tower moves from being a geological curiosity to being something that sits at the center of a much larger story. A story about who was in North America, when they arrived, how they organized themselves, what they knew about the world they inhabited, and what happened to them. The story of what happened to the people who built their lives around Devil's Tower requires us to confront one of the most disturbing and least discussed chapters of American prehistory, the megafaunal extinction event that swept across North America approximately 13,000 years ago. In the span of a few thousand years, at least 35 genera of large mammals disappeared from the Americas. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths that stood 12 feet tall, short-faced bears larger than grizzlies, American camels and horses, giant armadillos the size of small cars, American lions, dire wolves. The conventional explanation, still dominant in many textbooks, attributes this extinction wave primarily to hunting pressure from the newly arrived Clovis people. The first humans in the Americas, arriving around 13,000 years ago, encountered megafauna that had never before seen human hunters and were therefore naively unafraid. The hunters killed them faster than they could reproduce. Within a few thousand years, the large animals were gone. This explanation has problems, many problems. If the megafaunal extinction was caused by hunting, the timing of the extinctions across North and South America should correspond to the spread of human populations from north to south. In some cases, it does. In others, it does not. Some species disappeared before human arrival in their regions. Others survived the initial wave of human contact but disappeared later in a pattern that does not fit simple overkill. There is also a climate argument. The end of the last ice age brought rapid warming and ecological disruption that stressed the large mammals. Habitat that had been available for tens of thousands of years contracted sharply. Species that had survived multiple glacial cycles suddenly faced conditions they were not adapted to. And there is a third explanation, one that has been gaining scientific traction, and that, if correct, changes everything about our understanding of ancient North America. A cosmic impact. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, first formally proposed in a 2007 paper by a team of researchers examining sedimentary evidence from across North America, suggests that approximately 12,900 years ago, a comet or asteroid fragmented and struck the Earth's atmosphere and surface in multiple locations, triggering catastrophic fires, disrupting climate systems, and contributing to the rapid extinctions of the megafauna. The evidence cited in that original paper, and in the dozens of studies that have followed it, includes a thin layer of material found in sediment records across 4 continents, a layer that contains nanodiamonds, iridium concentrations above background levels, microscopic spherules of glass and carbon formed under conditions of extreme heat and pressure, and elevated platinum group elements, all of which are markers associated with extraterrestrial impact events. That layer, called the Younger Dryas boundary layer, has been found at more than 50 sites worldwide. The evidence for an impact event of some kind has been confirmed by multiple independent research teams using multiple different analytical methods. What remains debated is the scale, mechanism, and specific effects of whatever cosmic event deposited that layer. But here is what matters for our story. The Younger Dryas boundary layer has been found at sites in Wyoming, in sediments laid down 12,900 years ago in the geological vicinity of Devil's Tower. And the timing of the cosmic event coincides with the timing of major disruptions in the archaeological record of the region. Sites that show continuous occupation through the preceding millennia show gaps or total abandonment around the Younger Dryas boundary. Populations that had been steadily building their presence across the landscape suddenly appear to contract, consolidate, and in some cases vanish entirely from the record. Something happened 12,900 years ago that disrupted human life in the Devil's Tower region and across the continent. The mainstream account says climate change and megafaunal extinction pressured populations already thin and scattered. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis says those pressures were themselves triggered by a cosmic catastrophe that arrived without warning from the sky. If the impact hypothesis is correct, the people who had been building their civilization around Devil's Tower for thousands of years before the Younger Dryas did not simply fade away because the mammoths disappeared. They were struck by a disaster of unprecedented scale, a disaster that within years or decades fundamentally restructured the entire ecology of North America. And what survived among those people were the stories, the oral traditions, the memories of what had been preserved in the only medium that could survive. The human voice passing knowledge to other human voices, generation after generation, for 13,000 years. The Native American oral traditions surrounding the Younger Dryas period, identified not by that label of course, but by their content and the events they describe, have been the subject of increasing scholarly attention. And some of what has been found in those traditions is extraordinary. Stories from multiple tribal nations across North America describe, in varying detail, a time of catastrophe, fire from the sky, darkness that lasted for a long time, animals dying, water behaving strangely, stars falling, a world that was remade. These stories are not uniform. They come from different cultures, different regions, different linguistic traditions. But they share structural elements that are consistent with what we would expect from populations experiencing the aftermath of a major cosmic impact event: fire, darkness from particulates in the atmosphere, ecological disruption, animal die-offs, and the sense that the world as they had known it was fundamentally changed. Researchers studying these traditions have been careful not to claim more than the evidence supports. Oral traditions change over time. Stories accumulate layers of interpretation and embellishment. Separating genuine historical memory from mythological elaboration is extraordinarily difficult, and anyone who claims to do it with certainty is probably overreaching. But the convergence of these traditions, across cultures with no known contact with each other, on events consistent with a specific cosmic catastrophe at a specific point in time, is not something that can be entirely dismissed. The Australian Aboriginal example we mentioned earlier shows that oral traditions can preserve accurate environmental information across enormous spans of time. It is not unreasonable to ask whether North American oral traditions might be doing the same thing. And some of those traditions locate the catastrophe, or at least part of it, in a sky that was different from the sky we see today, a sky in which specific stars held positions they no longer occupy, corrected for precession, the positions they held approximately 12,000 to 13,000 years ago. The stories and the stars and the sediment all point to the same moment. After the catastrophe, what remained? The archaeological record suggests that human populations in North America were significantly reduced and reorganized in the wake of whatever happened at the Younger Dryas boundary. The elaborate networks and long-distance connections that are implied by the pre-Younger Dryas evidence contracted. Some regions were abandoned entirely for centuries. The density of occupation that had characterized the period before the catastrophe did not return for a very long time. But some things survived, and some places remained. Devil's Tower was still there. The Belle Fourche River still ran around its base. The magnetic anomaly still pulsed through the bedrock. The summit still offered its commanding view of the surrounding plains. And people came back. The post-Younger Dryas archaeological record at Devil's Tower begins to fill in around 10,000 years ago, which is within the conventionally accepted timeframe for human presence in the region. What is interesting about those early post-catastrophe layers is how they compare to the pre-catastrophe evidence. The post-catastrophe occupation looks, in some respects, like a reduced version of what came before. Similar types of tools, similar patterns of resource use, the same general orientation toward the tower as a central reference point, as if the people returning to the region were remembering a way of life from before the break, working to rebuild something they had lost. This is, of course, interpretive. The archaeological evidence does not come labeled with intentions. We are reading material remains and inferring the human stories behind them, which is always a process that involves uncertainty. But the inference is not arbitrary. The pattern of return, the maintenance of astronomical orientations toward Devil's Tower, the persistence of specific ritual behaviors at the same locations across the break in the record, all of these suggest not a completely new population starting fresh, but a continuation, however disrupted and diminished, of something older. The astronomical significance of Devil's Tower did not emerge only from the petroglyphs and rock art. It was recognized independently by modern researchers working from a completely different direction, and the convergence of those two independent lines of inquiry adds weight to what might otherwise be dismissed as overinterpretation of ambiguous evidence. The convergence begins with a question about the tower's orientation. Devil's Tower sits at a latitude of approximately 44.6 degrees north. At that latitude, and given the tower's height and the flatness of the surrounding plain, specific astronomical phenomena are visible from the tower's vicinity that would not be as precisely observable from nearby locations. In particular, the tower aligns with certain stellar rise and set positions, the first appearance of stars above the horizon at dawn and their last disappearance at dusk, that correspond to astronomically significant events in the ritual calendars of multiple native cultures. Researchers who have mapped these alignments in detail have found that from specific locations around the tower's base, viewing sightlines to particular horizon points frame specific star rises that mark seasonal transitions, solstices and equinoxes, and more subtle astronomical cycles. The alignments are not exact in every case. Some are more precise than others. But the overall pattern is not consistent with random chance. Someone, at some point, understood these alignments and used the tower as a reference point in a system of astronomical observation. The question of when that understanding first developed, whether it was a purely indigenous achievement of the historical period or something inherited from the deeper past, is one that the current evidence cannot definitively answer. But the evidence does not rule out a very ancient origin for the astronomical knowledge encoded in the tower's landscape relationships. Let us talk about what is still being found, because the story of Devil's Tower is not closed. It is actively developing, and some of the most significant discoveries are very recent. In 2018, a team conducting LiDAR surveys of the terrain around Devil's Tower using aerial laser scanning technology that can penetrate vegetation and reveal ground-level features invisible from above, documented a series of low earthen features on the surrounding plain that had not been previously mapped. The features are subtle, barely detectable above background terrain noise, which is why they had not been noticed in conventional aerial photography. But when the LiDAR data was processed and the features were plotted on a map, a pattern became visible. The earthen features, which appear to be the remnants of very low embankments or earthworks, form a system of geometric shapes extending outward from the tower in specific directions. The shapes are not perfectly preserved. Thousands of years of erosion have done significant damage, but their outlines are sufficient to suggest deliberate construction. This finding has not been fully published. The research team has presented preliminary findings at conferences and circulated a preprint through academic networks, but the full peer-reviewed paper had not appeared in final form, as of the time this script was researched. The caution that surrounds the publication process for findings this significant and controversial is understandable, but the existence of the LiDAR survey and its preliminary findings is documented. And what those findings suggest, if the interpretation holds up to full scrutiny, is that Devil's Tower was not just a natural landmark that people visited. It was a structure that people built around, incorporating the tower itself as the central element of a constructed landscape that extended for a considerable distance across the surrounding plain. The concept of a constructed sacred landscape, a region deliberately modified to enhance or frame a central natural feature, is well documented in other prehistoric contexts. Stonehenge sits within a landscape that includes dozens of other monuments and earthworks. The great ceremonial centers of ancient Mexico were positioned within carefully arranged complexes that used topography and alignment to amplify their astronomical and ritual functions. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the world's oldest known monumental structure, was built in a landscape relationship with the surrounding terrain that implies sophisticated understanding of geometry and orientation. If the LiDAR data at Devil's Tower represents what the preliminary analysis suggests, it would place Devil's Tower in the same category of deliberately structured sacred landscapes, a place that was not merely natural, but had been woven into a human system of meaning and observation over an immense span of time. The question of who built that system, or more precisely, who were the people who inherited and continued the ancient relationship with Devil's Tower that the evidence implies, is one that takes us into territory that is politically as well as scientifically complex. The official position of American archaeology, codified in federal law through the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, is that Native American peoples have a protected cultural relationship with ancient sites on the North American continent, including sites that predate the conventional 13,000-year threshold for human arrival. That legal framework is important and represents a significant improvement over earlier practices of treating native heritage as fair game for academic extraction. But the legal framework does not resolve the deeper historical questions. Were the people who created the earliest layers of activity at Devil's Tower the direct ancestors of the nations that claim the site today? Or does the evidence for extremely ancient occupation represent a different population, one whose relationship to modern native nations is complicated by the catastrophe and population restructuring of the Younger Dryas? These are questions that cannot be asked without care for their political implications, and they cannot be answered by the current evidence with any confidence. The genetic record for ancient American populations is still being assembled, and the deep pre-Younger Dryas period remains largely uncharacterized in molecular terms. What can be said is this: whatever happened 26,000 or 20,000 or 15,000 years ago at Devil's Tower, the people who have maintained continuous relationship with the site across recorded history are the native nations whose oral traditions preserve knowledge of it. Their stewardship is the direct continuation of the longest and most sustained human relationship with that place that we can document. And those traditions, taken seriously rather than patronized, may contain more information about Devil's Tower's full story than decades of academic research has yet recovered. The Lakota tradition about Devil's Tower, the one that most researchers encounter first, involves the story of 7 sisters being pursued by a bear. The sisters, fleeing the bear's attack, prayed for deliverance. The ground beneath their feet rose into a column of rock, lifting them to safety. The bear clawed at the sides of the rising rock, creating the column marks visible today. The sisters, now unreachable, were transformed into stars, becoming the Pleiades. This story has been appreciated as a beautiful myth. It has not typically been taken as a record of actual events, but consider what happens when you analyze the astronomical content of the story rather than its narrative surface. The Pleiades are a star cluster visible from the tower's location. They rise and set at specific points on the horizon, points that can be precisely identified. From certain positions around Devil's Tower's base, at certain times of year, the Pleiades rise above the tower's summit at specific times of night. Researchers who have computed these alignments have found that the story, if it is encoding an astronomical observation, is describing a specific relationship between the tower, the observer's position, and the Pleiades cluster that would have been particularly striking at specific points in the past, due to precession, The alignment was more dramatic thousands of years ago than it is today. The story is not describing random mythology. It is describing a real astronomical phenomenon observed from a real location on the Earth, preserved in narrative form across potentially thousands of years. This does not mean the story is literally true. The sisters were not transformed into stars. But it means the story may be doing what the Australian Aboriginal traditions do, using vivid narrative to encode and preserve precise environmental and astronomical information for future generations. And if that is what the Lakota story is doing, then the question becomes, when was the astronomical observation encoded? When did someone, standing at Devil's Tower, first note the relationship between this rock and those stars, and decide it was worth preserving in a story that would outlast any physical record? The precession calculations suggest the most striking version of that alignment, the one most likely to inspire a founding observation of sufficient impact to be preserved across millennia, corresponds to a date range of approximately 10,000 to 15,000 years before present. The astronomical content of the story may be that old, which means the story itself may be that old, or a version of it, the core astronomical observation wrapped in narrative clothing that has been updated and embellished across the generations, while the essential datum, the relationship between the rock and the stars, has been preserved intact. The implications of all of this: the worked stone at 26,000 years, the astronomical petroglyphs calibrated to an ancient sky, the electromagnetic anomalies, the LIDAR earthworks, the Younger Dryas catastrophe, the oral traditions, encoding ancient astronomical knowledge, extend well beyond Devil's Tower itself. If what the evidence suggests is true, that the Wyoming Plains supported a sophisticated and organized human presence for tens of thousands of years before the date conventional archaeology accepts for human arrival in the Americas, then the entire story of American prehistory needs to be rewritten, not revised at the margins, rewritten from the beginning. That rewriting is already happening, slowly, with all the resistance that radical paradigm shifts encounter in established academic disciplines. The pre-Clovis evidence from dozens of sites around the Americas has been accumulating for decades, and the academic community has been gradually, grudgingly updating its consensus. The Clovis first model is not dead, but it is badly wounded, and the new models being proposed to replace it, substantially more complex and more respectful of what the evidence actually shows. Devil's Tower sits at the intersection of several of those emerging storylines. It is a place where the geological record, the archaeological record, the astronomical evidence, and the oral historical tradition all point in the same direction, toward a human relationship with this specific piece of the North American landscape that is far older, far richer, and far more sophisticated than anything in our conventional account. There is one more dimension to the Devil's Tower story that we have not yet addressed, and it is perhaps the most difficult to discuss responsibly because it operates at the edge between what the evidence clearly supports and what remains genuinely mysterious and unresolved. The electromagnetic anomalies at Devil's Tower have been documented and explained in terms of the tower's mineral composition. That explanation is adequate for the measurable field distortions that affect compasses and electronic equipment. But the accounts of unusual experiences at Devil's Tower go beyond what electromagnetic field distortion would predict. Those accounts come from people across a wide range of backgrounds and have been collected by researchers interested in what is sometimes called anomalous cognition, the human experience of perceiving things that ordinary sense organs and brain function cannot explain. The experiences reported at Devil's Tower by visitors, both indigenous people, for whom the site carries deep cultural significance, and non-native visitors with no prior knowledge of the site's history, include unusual visual phenomena, the perception of presences, time distortion, vivid and unusually realistic dreams during sleep near the tower, and a specific and widely reported sense of being observed or attended to by something in or near the tower itself. These reports cannot be verified or quantified by conventional scientific methods. The people who report them are sincere, but sincerity is not evidence. The experiences could be psychological, driven by expectation, suggestion, the power of the environment to trigger altered states in receptive individuals. They could be caused in part by the electromagnetic environment, since it is documented that certain patterns of electromagnetic stimulation can produce unusual perceptual experiences. Or they could be something else. The honest answer is that we do not know. And the honest further answer is that the question has not been seriously studied, partly because of legitimate scientific caution about anomalous experience research, and partly because the question is culturally and politically sensitive in ways that make funding and publication difficult. What we can say is that the perception of Devil's Tower as a place of unusual power, a place where the ordinary rules of experience are suspended or modified, is documented across cultures and centuries. The native traditions that treat it as a place where worlds intersect are not describing something exclusive to their own experience. Visitors who arrive at the tower with no cultural context for such a perception often report something similar. There is something about that place that does something to people. What it is, whether it is electromagnetic, geological, psychological, or something that does not yet have a category in our explanatory frameworks, remains genuinely open. Let us pull back and look at the full picture. Devil's Tower, rising from the Wyoming plains, is one of the most studied and most puzzling geological features in North America. Its formation is understood in broad terms but contains unexplained details. Its relationship to human prehistory, when the full evidence base is examined rather than filtered through the constraints of conventional timelines, suggests an extremely long and sophisticated human engagement with the site. The astronomical alignments encoded in the surrounding landscape, in petroglyphs and earthworks and site orientations, point to a sustained tradition of observation and ceremony that may extend back further than conventional archaeology is prepared to acknowledge. The oral traditions of the peoples who have maintained relationship with the site contain astronomical and historical information that, when taken seriously, proves unexpectedly precise. And the Younger Dryas event, the cosmic catastrophe that may have struck the Americas 12,900 years ago, provides both an explanation for the gap in the record and a mechanism for why so much of what was built and known in the millennia before that catastrophe was lost. Not erased, but reduced, compressed into the most resilient and portable form available to any human society: stories. The shock that scientists experience when they look honestly at Devil's Tower is not a simple shock of discovery. It is more complicated than that. It is the shock of recognition, the slow, uncomfortable recognition that the Americas before Columbus were not what we were taught. That the people who lived here for tens of thousands of years before European contact were not primitive. That they had knowledge, organization, and cultural sophistication that our conventional frameworks have systematically underestimated. Devil's Tower has been standing there for 50 million years. The people who recognized its significance and built their world around it were doing so for at least several thousand years, and possibly tens of thousands. The stories they preserved about it contain information that outlasted stone tools and earthworks, and every physical trace of their civilization except one: themselves, their descendants, the living inheritors of that immense tradition. The scientists who have been working at Devil's Tower, the geologists and archaeoastronomers and physicists, have been shocked not primarily by what they have found in the rock, though what they have found there is remarkable enough. They have been shocked by the growing realization that the people who were here before us understood things about this place and about the world around it that we are only beginning to rediscover. The Belle Fourche River still runs around the base of Devil's Tower, cold and clear from its origins in the Black Hills, carrying in its currents a small fraction of the sediment that once buried the tower completely, the sediment that has been slowly giving up its secrets to the researchers who have learned to read it. The tower itself does not change on human timescales. Its columns stand, as they have stood for millions of years, indifferent to the questions we are asking about them, indifferent to the stories we tell about their origin. They simply are. And in simply being, they continue to generate questions, to pull researchers back, to resist the clean and final explanation that science always hopes for, but rarely finds with something this complex. The oldest stories about Devil's Tower, the ones encoded in languages that far predate English or any European tongue, say that the tower is a place where things can be known that cannot be known elsewhere, where the connections between the visible and the invisible, between the present and the deep past, are more accessible than in ordinary places. That is a description from a framework of knowledge very different from modern science. But standing at the base of the tower, aware of the accumulated evidence of human presence stretching back across ages that our textbooks do not acknowledge, aware of the astronomical alignments that connect this rock to the sky in ways that preserve observations made by people long dead, aware of the ongoing mysteries that every new study deepens rather than resolves, it is difficult to say that the old description is wrong. There is something at Devil's Tower that has not yet been fully explained, something that the people who lived with it for thousands of years understood in their own terms, something that modern science is approaching from a different direction but has not yet reached. The investigation continues. The story is not finished. The tower is still there. And so are the questions. Now, let us go deeper, because the story of what scientists have found at Devil's Tower is not only about the distant past. Some of the most significant and least publicized findings are much more recent, and they open onto questions that are as much about the present as about history. In the 1990s, a series of seismic studies were conducted in the region surrounding Devil's Tower as part of broader geological surveys of the Wyoming and Black Hills Basin. The primary goal of those surveys was to map subsurface geological structures for resource extraction purposes. The tower itself was not the focus, but it was within the survey area, and the seismic data collected in its vicinity turned out to be interesting in ways that went beyond the original research objectives. Seismic surveys work by sending sound waves into the earth and measuring how those waves reflect off subsurface geological features. Different rock types reflect sound differently, allowing researchers to build three-dimensional maps of subsurface geology without drilling. It is powerful, well-validated technology used extensively in the oil and gas industry and in academic geology. What the seismic surveys around Devil's Tower showed was a subsurface structure more complex than surface geology would predict. Below the tower, the survey data indicated what one of the researchers involved described as a series of nested anomalies, zones of subsurface geological irregularity extending downward from the tower's base to a depth of approximately 2 miles. The anomalies were not random. They showed a pattern of concentric structures centered on the tower, with properties that did not match the standard model of a simple igneous intrusion. The leading interpretation of those anomalies is that they represent the remains of a much more extensive igneous body, a larger magmatic system from which the visible tower is only the central exposed remnant. That interpretation is geologically plausible and is probably substantially correct. Contents of the detailed features of the subsurface anomaly pattern are unusual. Specifically, there appear to be planar zones within the subsurface structure, flat-lying layers of anomalous material that cut across the expected orientation of a cooling igneous body in ways that require additional explanation. The leading hypothesis is that those planar zones represent surfaces where the intruding magma contacted and partially incorporated the surrounding sedimentary rock, creating hybrid zones with different physical properties. That explanation works for some of the observed features. It does not work perfectly for all of them. And again, the researchers who have looked most carefully at the subsurface data have noted the unusual regularity of the anomaly pattern. A natural igneous system should produce somewhat irregular subsurface structures. The concentric symmetry of the Devil's Tower subsurface anomalies is unusual. Not unprecedented, but unusual. The combination of surface geometry and subsurface structure has led a small number of geologists, working at the edge of mainstream consensus, to propose a hypothesis about Devil's Tower's formation that diverges from the standard story in a specific and testable way. The standard story says the tower is a laccolith, an intrusion that formed when magma pushed into sedimentary layers and cooled before reaching the surface. The alternative hypothesis says the tower may instead be, or may contain elements of, a Mare diatreme volcanic structure, a type of explosion crater formed when magma encounters groundwater and undergoes rapid, violent steam-driven eruption. Mare diatreme structures are well documented in geology. Kimberlite pipes, the structures that bring diamonds to the surface, are a type of diatreme. The distinctive features of Mare diatremes include pipe-like vertical structures, fragmental rock types mixed through the pipe during explosive emplacement, and contact zones between the intruded rock and surrounding material that show evidence of rapid, high-energy processes. Some of those features have been identified at Devil's Tower. The contact zone between the phonolite porphyry of the tower and the surrounding sedimentary rock shows evidence of violent emplacement in some sections. The rock types present within the tower's body include some fragmental materials that are more consistent with explosive than with quiet, intrusive formation. This is not a radical reinterpretation of Devil's Tower's basic geology. Whether it formed as a laccolith or a diatreme, the igneous origin is not in question. But the distinction matters because diatreme structures form in ways that produce surface expression differently from laccoliths. A diatreme that reached the surface during its formation would have created a volcanic explosion crater at the surface before the surrounding rock eroded, a crater that would have been visible and dramatic in the landscape for thousands or millions of years. If Devil's Tower formed as a diatreme, the ancient landscape around it would have looked very different from the flat plains that surround it today. There would have been, for a very long time, in the geological past, a crater feature associated with the tower, a depression in the surrounding terrain that would have collected water, concentrated resources, and created a very distinctive and memorable landscape feature. By the time humans arrived, that crater would have been long gone, eroded away over millions of years. But the shape of the subsurface geology might still preserve traces of it. And some of those traces appear in the seismic data. A tower rising from the center of an ancient crater, preserved in the rock beneath the present-day plain, is a specific kind of place. It is a place of origin, a place where the earth itself opened in a moment of creation that would have been, in geological terms, catastrophically dramatic. Not just a rock sticking up from the plain, but a monument to an ancient eruption, the central spire of what was once a volcanic crown. That understanding of what Devil's Tower is, at its deepest geological level, is consistent with the native traditions that speak of it as a place of emergence, a place where creation itself became visible. The traditions were not describing volcanology in modern terms, but they may have been preserving, in their own way, knowledge of what the geological record shows. That this tower marks a place where the deep forces of the earth once came to the surface in a spectacular and lasting way. The relationship between geological knowledge and cultural memory is one of the genuinely fascinating emerging fields in the study of ancient peoples. Researchers working in what is called geomythology, the study of geological events encoded in cultural traditions, have demonstrated that oral traditions can preserve accurate records of geological events across surprising spans of time. We have already mentioned the Australian Aboriginal oral traditions that preserve accurate coastal geography from before the post-glacial sea level rise 10,000 years ago. The study of those traditions has been replicated and confirmed across multiple Aboriginal language groups. The encoded geological information is real. In North America, a similar line of research has been examining native oral traditions about geological events, particularly volcanic activity, earthquake events, and unusual landscape features. The results have been striking. Traditions from the Pacific Northwest that describe a great catastrophic flood have been shown to correspond with the documented geological evidence for a catastrophic release of ice-dammed glacial Lake Missoula, an event that sent a wall of water across the Columbia Plateau approximately 13,000 to 14,000 years ago. The flood described in the traditions and the flood documented in the geology are the same event. Against that background of documented geomythological accuracy, the oral traditions about Devil's Tower deserve more serious attention than they have typically received. If the traditions encode astronomical information about the sky as it appeared thousands of years ago, as the precession analysis suggests, and if they encode geological information about the tower's character as a place of volcanic origin, as the geomythological reading would suggest, then they are not mythology in the dismissive sense. They are geology and astronomy expressed in narrative form. The people who created and preserved those traditions knew things. They knew them through direct observation and through the accumulated observations of their ancestors across very long spans of time. The modern researchers who are rediscovering the scientific content of those traditions are not finding new information. They are finding that the old information was right. There is a concept in complexity theory that applies with unusual force to what we are finding at Devil's Tower. The concept is called emergence, the phenomenon by which complex systems display properties at the large scale that cannot be predicted simply by looking at their components at the small scale. Water molecules do not individually display wetness, but water displays wetness. Individual neurons do not individually display consciousness, but networks of neurons display consciousness. The study of Devil's Tower over the past century has mostly been a study of components, geological components, the mineralogy of the phonolite, the mechanics of columnar jointing, the thermal history of the intrusion, archaeological components, individual artifact types, individual site locations, individual dates, astronomical components, specific alignments, specific petroglyphs. What is now happening, slowly and not yet completely, is that researchers from different disciplines are beginning to look at all of those components together and see what emerges from the interaction. What emerges is not the simple sum of its parts. What emerges is a picture of a place that operated, for an extremely long time, as a kind of nexus, a point of convergence for geological forces, for human habitation and ceremony, for astronomical observation, for long-distance communication, for the preservation and transmission of accumulated knowledge. The shock of what scientists are finding at Devil's Tower is not the shock of a single dramatic discovery, though individual discoveries have been dramatic enough. It is the shock of emergence, the shock of seeing a pattern that only becomes visible when you look at the full system rather than at any individual component. And that emergent pattern, the pattern that has only become visible in the past few decades as the evidence from multiple disciplines has accumulated to critical mass, tells a story about American prehistory that is larger and older and more sophisticated than anything in our textbooks. There is something we should address directly about why this story has taken so long to emerge, because the delays and resistances are themselves informative. The academic study of American prehistory has been shaped by institutional and cultural forces that have systematically biased it towards certain conclusions and away from others. The 19th century framework that treated Native Americans as static, timeless presences on the landscape, incapable of historical development in the Western sense, made it impossible to see the evidence for prehistoric sophistication even when it was present. Artifacts that clearly implied complex social organization were reinterpreted in ways that minimized their implications. Oral traditions were dismissed as mythology. Sites that challenged the accepted timeline were avoided, or their findings buried in obscure publications. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the documented history of a scientific field that, like all scientific fields, was embedded in the cultural assumptions of the society that produced it. Those assumptions have changed, but slowly, and with significant resistance from researchers whose professional investments are tied to the old framework. The pre-Clovis evidence that has been accumulating for decades would, in any other field, have forced a complete revision of the foundational timeline long ago. In American archaeology, it has been met with a skepticism that goes beyond appropriate scientific caution and becomes, in some cases, ideological resistance. Researchers who publish pre-Clovis findings face a specific pattern of professional challenge that is more intense than what would be directed at comparably anomalous findings in other domains. This is changing. The weight of evidence has become too great to ignore. But the pace of change has been slower than the evidence warranted, and the delay has meant that a generation of researchers at places like Devil's Tower have been working within a framework that made it difficult to take their most significant findings seriously. As that framework is revised, as the pre-Clovis timeframe for American occupation becomes the new consensus, the findings from Devil's Tower and comparable sites gain a context that makes their implications legible in ways they were not before. The experience of visiting Devil's Tower today is shaped by the National Park Service, which has managed the site since it became the first national monument in 1906 under President Theodore Roosevelt. The park infrastructure, visitor centers, maintained trails, ranger programs, does an excellent job of conveying the geological story and of acknowledging the site's cultural significance to native nations. What it does less well, which is not a criticism, but simply an observation about what is and is not yet settled enough to be included in public interpretation, is convey the full depth and complexity of what is being discovered about the site. The visitor center displays explain columnar jointing and volcanic geology. They acknowledge the sacred character of the site to the Lakota, Cheyenne, Crow, and other nations. They describe the site's history from first European encounter through the present. They do not explain the pre-Clovis evidence in the nearby sediments. They do not display the LiDAR earthwork data. They do not address the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis and its implications for the region. They do not attempt to translate the astronomical content of the surrounding petroglyphs in the full technical depth that the most recent research has achieved. This is as it should be, in some respects. National park interpretive materials need to reflect settled scientific consensus, not cutting-edge and contested research findings. But it means that the public understanding of Devil's Tower is significantly behind the actual state of knowledge. The story that most visitors take home from the monument is far simpler, far less surprising, and far less honest about the depth of the mystery than the story that the evidence actually supports. The gap between the official story and the emerging research findings is one of the most interesting things about Devil's Tower right now. It is a gap that is being filled, slowly, as findings move through the peer review process, and as the broader shift in American prehistory consensus makes space for interpretations that would previously have been professionally risky. Within the next decade, the story that is told at the visitor center may look very different from what it says today. What does it mean, all of this, for how we understand who we are and where we came from? The humans who lived in the Wyoming plains 20,000 or 26,000 years ago, if the evidence at Devil's Tower and comparable sites accurately reflects their presence, were our ancestors in the most direct sense. Not metaphorically, not in some abstract evolutionary sense, but literally. Their descendants, the populations that survived the catastrophes of the Younger Dryas and the millennia of disruption that followed, became the peoples that European colonizers encountered beginning in the 15th century. The story of those peoples has been distorted by centuries of colonialism, by deliberate erasure of indigenous history, by the intellectual frameworks that refuse to see their ancestors as fully human, in the sense of being capable of the same sophistication and complexity that Western civilization claimed as its exclusive achievement. What the evidence from Devil's Tower and comparable sites is showing us is that the ancestors of Native Americans were, in fact, exactly that sophisticated. They were astronomers. They were engineers of cultural memory. They were keepers of knowledge spanning tens of thousands of years. They were people who built their understanding of the world around a specific relationship with specific features of the landscape, relationships so deep and so carefully maintained that traces of them survive in the rock and the oral tradition alike. The shock of what scientists are finding at Devil's Tower is partly the shock of confronting how wrong we have been about all of this. How thoroughly the Western intellectual tradition has underestimated the people who were here before us. How much has been lost because their knowledge was not taken seriously when it could have been preserved more completely. But it is also the shock of recognition. The recognition that the human capacity for sophisticated observation, for complex cultural organization, for the creation and maintenance of meaning across vast spans of time, is not an achievement of Western civilization. It is an achievement of humanity itself, present from the beginning, expressed in forms that Western civilization was not equipped to recognize. Devil's Tower has been teaching that lesson for a long time. We are only now beginning to learn it. The Belle Fourche River still reflects the tower's image in the calm sections between its riffles. The starlings and swallows that nest in the cracks of the columns still trace their arcs around the tower's base in the evening light. The grasses of the surrounding plain still bend in the wind that comes off the Black Hills. And somewhere under that ground, in sediment layers that have not yet been excavated, in the subsurface geology that has not yet been fully mapped, in the oral traditions that have not yet been fully listened to, there is more story waiting to be recovered. The scientists who study Devil's Tower do not talk much about being shocked. Scientists are trained to describe their findings in measured, hedged, careful language, to present their data and let readers draw their own conclusions. But sometimes, in interviews and conference presentations and the informal conversations that happen at the edges of academic gatherings, the language slips into something more honest. They talk about the feeling of looking at the seismic data for the first time and realizing that the subsurface structure is far more complex than they had expected. They talk about the moment when the LiDAR earthwork pattern became visible and they understood what they were looking at. They talk about reading the precession-corrected positions of the astronomical alignments and matching them to dates that no one was supposed to have been here. They talk about the convergence, the way multiple independent lines of evidence keep pointing at the same conclusion, like compasses all pointing toward the same north. Shock is the right word for it. Not the dramatic shock of a sudden revelation, but the slow, accumulating shock of a story that turns out to be immeasurably larger than you thought it was. America's Devil's Tower is a rock, 50 million years old, give or take. It is also a record. A record of geological violence and slow exposure, of human presence and astronomical observation, and cultural memory and catastrophe and survival, stretching across a time frame that our conventional histories have refused to take seriously. The investigation is ongoing. The full extent of what will be found there, in the rock and the sediment and the sky and the tradition, remains unknown. But what has already been found is enough to rewrite significant portions of what we thought we knew about this continent and the people who have lived on it. The tower stands, the questions accumulate, and the story that was always there, waiting to be found, is slowly, finally being told. But we are not done yet. Because there are dimensions of the Devil's Tower story that reach outward from Wyoming into a continental pattern, connecting the tower to a network of sites and findings across North America that, taken together, suggest a prehistory even more remarkable than the Devil's Tower evidence alone would imply. Let us follow those connections. The ancient people who organized their landscape around Devil's Tower were not the only people in North America who built their world around specific natural landmarks with astronomical significance. Across the continent, from the medicine wheels of the northern plains to the great earthworks of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys to the solar alignments of Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, there is a pattern of sophisticated astronomical observation encoded in the built and natural landscape. These sites have been studied individually. What has been less fully appreciated is the network that connects them. The orientations and alignments of different sites often reference the same astronomical events. The solar and lunar cycles that are marked at Chaco Canyon correspond to cycles marked at Ohio earthworks hundreds of miles away. The stellar alignments of medicine wheels in Montana and Wyoming orient to the same star-rise events that the petroglyphs near Devil's Tower encode. This continental-scale astronomical network is not accidental. It reflects a shared framework, a common cosmological system that was maintained across vast distances by populations that had ways of communicating and coordinating that we have barely begun to reconstruct. Devil's Tower sits within that network as a central node, a convergence point where the landscape itself provides the alignment references that other sites achieve through constructed monuments. The tower's natural geometry, its height, its location, its electromagnetic signature, its relationship to specific sections of the sky, all make it an ideal fixed point around which a larger astronomical system can be organized. And the people who used it as such fixed point were working within a tradition of observation and knowledge that extended, the evidence increasingly suggests, much further back in time than conventional archaeology has been prepared to acknowledge. The question of how that tradition came to be, how humans came to possess the astronomical knowledge encoded in the ancient American sites, is one that connects to the larger question of how human beings, as a species, came to understand the sky. Modern astronomy typically traces its history to the ancient Near East, to Babylonian and Egyptian observations that were later synthesized by Greek astronomers into the frameworks that eventually became Western scientific astronomy. That is the standard story. But the standard story assumes that sophisticated astronomical observation was a relatively late cultural achievement, developing in settled agricultural civilizations, with the leisure and institutional capacity for systematic long-term observation. What the evidence from sites like Devil's Tower, from the ancient Americas broadly, and from comparable sites in other parts of the world, is suggesting is that astronomical knowledge goes back much further than the standard story allows. That hunter-gatherer populations, who needed to track the seasons accurately for survival, who navigated vast territories using stellar references, who organized their ceremonial lives around the cycles of the sky, developed sophisticated observational traditions long before agriculture made permanent settlements possible. That knowledge, accumulated over tens of thousands of years of observation, preserved through oral tradition and encoded in the landscape, was the foundation on which the later astronomical traditions of settled civilizations were built. The Babylonians and Egyptians were not starting from scratch. They were inheriting and systematizing knowledge that had been building for far longer than their own histories remembered, and some of that ancient knowledge was preserved, in fragmentary and transformed but genuine form, at places like Devil's Tower, in the rock art and the earthworks and the oral traditions of the peoples who maintained relationship with the site across the millennia. The electromagnetic dimension of Devil's Tower connects to a broader pattern that has been documented, though not yet fully understood, at sacred sites around the world. Many of the places that human cultures have designated as sacred across history, from Stonehenge to the Great Pyramid, to the temples of Angkor Wat, to the oracle sites of ancient Greece, sit on geological formations with unusual electromagnetic or geophysical properties, concentrations of magnetic minerals, underground water systems that create telluric currents, electrical flows through the Earth's crust, fault lines and fracture zones that channel unusual patterns of energy. The correlation between geological anomaly and cultural sanctification is too consistent to be coincidental. Multiple researchers have proposed that it reflects a genuine sensitivity in human perception to electromagnetic environments, a sensitivity that may be vestigial in most people, but is more pronounced in individuals predisposed to unusual perceptual experience. The hypothesis is that people who are highly sensitive to electromagnetic phenomena, shamans, seers, spiritual specialists, were drawn to places with unusual geophysical character, where their sensitivity was amplified by the environment. Over time, the experiences reported from those places, visions, unusual perceptions, altered states, became the basis for the sacred character attributed to the sites. The geological anomaly generated the experience generated the cultural designation. At Devil's Tower, this framework would suggest that the electromagnetic anomalies were a significant factor in the site's initial sanctification and continued use as a ceremonial location. The unusual experiences that many people report at the tower would, in this framework, not be supernatural, but also not be entirely subjective. They would be the product of an interaction between the human perceptual system and a genuinely unusual physical environment. This framework does not resolve the mystery, it relocates it. Instead of asking why people have unusual experiences at Devil's Tower, it asks how human perception interacts with electromagnetic environments, which is a question that current neuroscience is still in the early stages of addressing. But it does provide a scientifically grounded way of thinking about why Devil's Tower has been special to so many people across so many centuries. Not because something supernatural inhabits it, but because something physical about it speaks to something in us that most of us do not normally notice. The water table around Devil's Tower is higher than in the surrounding plain, a consequence of the geological structure of the intrusion and its relationship to the regional hydrology. The Belle Fourche River's course around the tower's base is partially determined by the subsurface geology of the tower itself, which acts as a barrier that channels groundwater flow and shapes the river's path. This means that the immediate vicinity of Devil's Tower has historically been better watered than the surrounding terrain, supporting denser vegetation, more diverse wildlife, and more reliable water sources than comparable areas of the plain. For hunter-gatherer populations, this ecological advantage would have been significant, making the tower's base a preferred habitation zone independent of any astronomical or ceremonial considerations. The combination of ecological advantage and geophysical unusualness would have made Devil's Tower attractive on multiple levels simultaneously. Practical resource considerations would have brought populations to the vicinity. The unusual perceptual environment would have encouraged them to interpret the place as sacred. The distinctive visual character of the tower and its astronomical alignments would have made it a navigation and calendar tool. The electromagnetic signature would have made it attractive to individuals with heightened perceptual sensitivity. All of these factors, working together over time, would have created a self-reinforcing cycle of attention and return. The more important the site became in the cultural life of the region, the more frequently it was visited. The more frequently it was visited, the more the accumulated knowledge about its properties was deepened and refined. The more refined the knowledge, the more central the site became to the cosmological framework of the populations using it. This is how sacred places develop over time. Not through a single founding experience, but through an accumulating tradition of engagement, understanding, and meaning-making that deepens with each generation and each century. At Devil's Tower, the evidence suggests that accumulation extended across more generations and more centuries than we had previously imagined. As we come toward the end of this exploration, there is something important to acknowledge about the limits of what we know. The story we have been telling here, the story of pre-Clovis occupation and ancient astronomical knowledge and Younger Dryas catastrophe and preserved oral tradition, is assembled from evidence that is real and documented but that is not, in most of its more dramatic implications, yet fully settled in academic consensus. The trajectory of the evidence points clearly in certain directions. The emerging consensus among researchers working at the cutting edge of American prehistory supports most of the broad outlines of what we have described. But the specific claims, the 26,000-year dates, the LIDAR earthworks, the precession-corrected astronomical alignments, remain contested and continue to be refined. This is how science works. The findings are real. The interpretations are evolving. The story we can tell today is more complete and more surprising than the story we could have told a decade ago. The story that will be tellable a decade from now will be more complete and more surprising still. Devil's Tower will still be there when that story is fully told. The Belle Fourche will still be running. The columns will still be standing, hexagonal and geometrically unsettling, rising above the Wyoming plain into a sky that has watched over this place for longer than human language has existed to describe it. And somewhere in the sediment around the tower's base, and in the rock art on the surrounding canyon walls, and in the traditions that the native nations have maintained with extraordinary resilience against centuries of pressure to abandon them, the full story is waiting. It was always waiting. We are only now learning to read it. What scientists have found at America's Devil's Tower is not a single discovery, but a revelation in the original sense of that word, an unveiling, the gradual removal of layers of assumption and misunderstanding to reveal what was always there, waiting to be seen. What was there is a place at the center of a story about who human beings are and what we are capable of across the full span of our presence on this continent. A story about knowledge accumulated across tens of thousands of years and preserved through catastrophe and disruption in the most resilient medium available. The human voice telling the human story to human ears across all the generations that stand between the first person who looked at that tower and understood something important about it, and the researchers who are, right now, finally beginning to understand what that person knew. The shock that this produces in those who look at it honestly is real. The story it tells about American prehistory is not the story we were taught. The people it describes are not the people we were taught to expect. The time frame it implies is not the time frame that our textbooks acknowledge, but it is the story that the evidence supports. And in the long run, the story that the evidence supports is the story that will be told. Devil's Tower stands at the intersection of deep time and living memory. The scientists who are learning to read what is written there are finding that both the time and the memory run deeper than anyone had dared to claim. That is the true story of what has been found there. And it has, by any honest measure, shocked the world. There is a season in Wyoming when the light does something unusual. In the weeks around the summer solstice, when the days are at their longest, and the sun takes an arc across the sky that seems almost too generous, the light at the end of the afternoon turns a color that does not have a name in English. It is not gold exactly, and not orange, and not the amber of late autumn. It is something that belongs specifically to the high plains of the interior West, to the particular combination of altitude and aridity and the vast, unobstructed sky. In that light, Devil's Tower changes. The hexagonal columns, which at midday read as grey and brown, uniform and geologically matter-of-fact, begin to glow with something internal, as if the phonolite porphyry is producing its own illumination rather than reflecting the sun's. The shadows between the columns deepen into absolute black, creating a pattern of light and dark that shifts as the sun moves, giving the tower a sense of breath, of slow movement, of something alive within the stone. Visitors who see it in that light sometimes try to photograph it and find that the photographs do not capture what they saw. The camera faithfully records the photons, but misses the experience, the sense of being in the presence of something that is operating on a timescale so different from human time that it registers not as object, but as entity. This is not mysticism. It is phenomenology, the description of experience as it actually occurs rather than as it is theoretically supposed to occur. And it points to something real about Devil's Tower, that the geological description, however accurate, does not fully convey. The tower is very old. 50 million years is a span so vast that the entire history of our species, all 300,000 years of it, represents less than 1% of 1% of the tower's existence. When the tower was forming, deep underground, cooling slowly from liquid rock into its distinctive hexagonal columns, the ancestors of our ancestors were small mammals, hiding in the undergrowth from dinosaurs, not yet evolved into primates, not yet capable of the kind of consciousness that would eventually look up at the tower and wonder about it. The human relationship with Devil's Tower, however ancient it turns out to be, is a very thin film of meaning laid over an incomprehensibly deeper geological reality. And yet that thin film of human meaning is, from the perspective of the beings capable of meaning, everything. The Black Hills of South Dakota and Wyoming have been called the center of the world by the Lakota people who know them best. That is not hyperbole or metaphor, at least not entirely. It is a cosmological claim that this specific place, this cluster of ancient hills rising from the plains, occupies a central position, not just geographically, but in the structure of reality itself. Western thinking tends to treat such claims as spiritual metaphor, as the naturally human tendency to place one's home at the center of the conceptual universe. Every culture does this. It means nothing beyond the universal human need for an orienting center. But what if some cosmological claims are not just cultural metaphor, but encoded geographical and astronomical knowledge, claims about a place's real position in a network of relationships that are objectively present in the landscape? The Black Hills, of which Devil's Tower is the most dramatic outlier, do occupy a distinctive position in the geography of the interior West. They are the highest point between the Rockies and the Appalachians, a 100-mile island of forested hills rising from the surrounding plains. They are visible from extraordinary distances in every direction. They have been a landmark for navigation across the northern plains for as long as anyone or anything has navigated there. The claim that they are the center of the world, understood not mystically but practically and observationally, is a claim about their role as a reference point, an orienting landmark in a landscape that without them would offer few fixed points for position and direction. They are the center of the world in the same sense that the pole star is the center of the sky, not because the universe revolves around them, but because they function as the fixed point around which a system of orientation is organized. Devil's Tower, at the western edge of the Black Hills, is the most visible and distinctive element of that reference system. It is the point of the arrow, the sharpest and most unambiguous landmark in a landscape of landmarks. Understanding the Black Hills and Devil's Tower as a practical navigation system, a continental-scale reference frame for the people who inhabited the surrounding territory, makes sense of patterns in the archaeological record that have otherwise been puzzling. The density of sites oriented toward the Black Hills, the long-distance trade routes that converge on the region, the astronomical alignments that use specific hills and the tower as reference points. These are not the scattered marks of unconnected populations living in isolation. They are the organized products of a shared navigation and cosmological system maintained across vast distances and long periods of time. The question of how that system was maintained, how knowledge of astronomical alignments and site orientations was transmitted across the distances and generations that the evidence implies, leads us to one of the most interesting and underappreciated aspects of ancient American culture: the role of specialist knowledge keepers. In literate cultures, knowledge is preserved in text. Libraries and archives accumulate the accumulated understanding of generations in forms that can survive the deaths of those who created them. In non-literate cultures, knowledge is preserved in memory, in practice, in the bodies of specialists who have undergone years of training to become living repositories of their community's accumulated understanding. The astronomical traditions encoded in the landscape around Devil's Tower, if they are as old and as complex as the evidence suggests, required exactly this kind of specialist transmission. Someone had to know which petroglyphs recorded which observations. Someone had to know how to correct the positions of stars for precession. Someone had to know the relationship between the tower's summit signal fires and the network of people across the surrounding territory who were watching for them. This knowledge did not maintain itself. It was maintained by people, specific people with specific responsibilities, who devoted their lives to learning what their predecessors had learned and passing it on to the next generation of keepers. The shamans and astronomical specialists documented in historical and ethnographic accounts of plains and plateau cultures are the descendants and inheritors of that tradition. Their knowledge, though necessarily changed and reduced from whatever fullness it once had, carries traces of the ancient astronomical tradition that the landscape evidence implies. And some researchers have argued, carefully and with appropriate qualifications, that the most complete surviving repositories of ancient knowledge about the Black Hills region are not academic papers or museum collections, but the oral traditions and ceremonial practices of the nations whose ancestors maintained that knowledge. If that argument is correct, the collaboration between academic researchers and native knowledge keepers that has been developing in recent years is not just politically desirable, but scientifically essential. The full story of Devil's Tower cannot be recovered from the geological and archaeological evidence alone. Some of it can only be recovered by listening to the people who have been keeping it. The modern political and legal landscape of Devil's Tower is worth understanding because it shapes what research happens there and how findings are interpreted and communicated. Devil's Tower was designated as the first United States national monument in 1906, removing it from the landscape of private ownership and placing it under federal stewardship. That designation was made without consultation with or consent from the native nations who had maintained relationship with the site for thousands of years, which was consistent with the practices of the federal government at the time, but is recognized today as a significant injustice. In the decades since, the relationship between the National Park Service and the native nations with historic ties to Devil's Tower has evolved substantially. The site is now recognized as sacred by at least 26 different tribal nations. A voluntary climbing closure during June, the primary month of traditional ceremonies at the site, has been in place since 1995. Though it has been legally challenged by rock climbing advocacy groups and its status has been periodically uncertain, the management of the site involves ongoing negotiation between multiple parties with different and sometimes conflicting interests. The Park Service, the climbing community, tourism interests, and the tribal nations. That negotiation is itself a kind of story about the unresolved legacies of American history and the still incomplete process of reckoning with what was done to indigenous peoples and their relationship to the land. Against that backdrop, the scientific research happening at Devil's Tower takes on additional dimensions. Findings that rewrite the timeline of human presence in the region are not just of academic interest. They have implications for how the site's significance is understood, who has claims to it, and how its future should be managed. Research that validates the extreme antiquity of indigenous connection to the land is research that supports indigenous sovereignty claims in ways that go beyond the merely historical. Some researchers working at the site are acutely aware of these dimensions and work to conduct their research in ways that build partnership with native communities rather than extracting information without acknowledgement. Others work more in the traditional mode of academic research that treats the site as an object of study rather than as a living place with living stakeholders. The tension between those approaches is productive in some ways and frustrating in others, but it is part of the full story of what is happening at Devil's Tower, and a story about the science cannot be complete without acknowledging it. Let us return to the stone itself. The phonolite porphyry that makes up Devil's Tower has properties that go beyond its visual appearance and its magnetic character. Phonolite is named for the ringing sound it makes when struck. It is an unusual rock type, formed from magma with a specific chemical composition that produces, when the rock solidifies, a tight and uniform crystal structure. That crystal structure is what gives the rock its distinctive acoustic properties. Strike a piece of phonolite, and it produces a clear, resonant tone, like a bell, rather than the dull thud of ordinary rock. This property would not have gone unnoticed by people who spent extended time at the tower's base. The fallen columns that litter the talus slopes around the tower's base include many pieces of phonolite that would ring clearly when struck. The tower itself, if struck with sufficient force, would produce tones that travel considerable distances across the plains. The acoustic properties of ancient sacred sites have been studied with increasing rigor over the past 2 decades, and the findings have been consistently interesting. Stonehenge produces measurable acoustic effects that concentrate sound within the monument in ways that would have enhanced the ritual experience of ceremonies held there. Certain chambers in European megalithic tombs have resonance frequencies that suggest deliberate acoustic design. The Great Kivas of Chaco Canyon have measurable acoustic properties that concentrate and amplify specific frequency ranges. At Devil's Tower, the acoustic dimension is different from these built monuments because the tower is not a constructed acoustic space. But the natural acoustic properties of the surrounding terrain, the way sound travels and reflects in the valley of the Belfourche River, the resonant properties of the fallen phonolite on the talus slopes, would have contributed to the sensory experience of the site in ways that complement its visual and electromagnetic character. People who spent time at Devil's Tower heard as well as saw something unusual. The combination of unusual sound, unusual light, unusual electromagnetic environment, and the overwhelming visual presence of the tower itself would have created a sensory experience quite unlike anything available elsewhere in the surrounding landscape. In contexts where human consciousness is receptive to unusual perceptual input, that kind of multisensory unusualness tends to produce significant and lasting experiences. It makes memories. It generates meaning. It creates the conditions for exactly the kind of cultural attachment that the long history of human engagement with Devil's Tower represents. There is a moment in the study of ancient sacred places when the researcher stops seeing the site as an object and starts experiencing it as a subject. When the accumulated evidence of thousands of years of human attention and meaning-making stops being archaeological data and starts being, in some less analyzable sense, present, researchers who have spent extended time at Devil's Tower describe something like this in language that is necessarily imprecise because the experience does not fit neatly into the vocabulary of scientific description. It is not spiritual experience in any conventional religious sense. It is more like a recognition, the recognition that this place has been attended to by human minds across an immensity of time, and that the accumulated weight of that attention has somehow left traces in the place itself. This may be purely psychological. Human minds are extraordinarily good at detecting pattern and meaning, and extraordinarily prone to projecting significance onto things that are significant, mainly in the human response to them. The sense of presence at sacred sites may be entirely a product of the observer's awareness of the site's history and cultural importance, a reflection of accumulated human meaning, rather than a perception of something intrinsic to the place. But there is another possibility, not supernatural but still unfamiliar to conventional thinking. The possibility that places that have been attended to with sustained human intention across very long periods of time are literally different from places that have not been. Not because attention changes the rock or the electromagnetic field in any direct physical way, but because the patterns of use and observation and ceremony that accumulate at important places over time shape the landscape in subtle ways, creating sensory cues and environmental patterns that later generations of visitors respond to without knowing why. The paths worn by generations of feet, the subtle changes in vegetation patterns around frequently visited spots, the acoustic environments shaped by windbreaks and water features that were chosen and maintained because they offered particular sensory qualities, the astronomical alignments that are only perceptible from specific positions that people return to because those positions were remembered as important. The accumulated human history of a place is physically encoded in the place, not just in the archaeological deposits and the rock art, but in the landscape itself, in subtle patterns of use and modification that span millennia. Visiting a place like Devil's Tower is, in a very literal sense, walking in footsteps that are too old and too numerous to see individually, but that have shaped the terrain in aggregate. That is not mysticism. That is ecology. And it may be part of why the experience of being at Devil's Tower is not the same as looking at a photograph of it. The grizzly bears that once ranged across the Wyoming plains are gone from the Devil's Tower vicinity now, reduced to small populations in the more remote mountain regions. But the geological record and the oral traditions of the region both preserve memory of when they were present in large numbers, when the meeting of human hunters and large carnivores was an everyday reality that shaped the strategies and psychology of everyone in the ecosystem. The story of the sisters and the bear that explains the marks on Devil's Tower's sides places the bear at the center of a creation narrative about the tower itself. This is not coincidence. In many North American traditions, the bear occupies a position in the cosmological hierarchy that reflects the bear's actual ecological significance, its role as the dominant large predator, the animal most nearly equivalent to humans in intelligence and social behavior, the creature most capable of interacting with humans on something approaching a peer basis rather than simply as prey or threat. The columns of Devil's Tower, in the bear story, are the marks left by an animal trying to reach something it could not reach, trying to cross a boundary that proved impossible. The story encodes a real ecological relationship, the boundary between the human world and the world of large predators, a boundary that was never stable or fixed, but always being negotiated, sometimes violently, sometimes through the accommodations that characterize the long coevolution of humans and megafauna. That relationship, the relationship between early humans and the large animals that shared their landscape, is itself part of the story of Devil's Tower. The tower's base would have been a place where those relationships were constantly in play, where the ecological richness that made the site attractive to humans also attracted the large predators that competed with humans for resources. Managing those relationships, knowing where bears and wolves and lions ranged and how to avoid or respond to them, was essential knowledge for the people who inhabited the region. Some of that knowledge may have been preserved and transmitted through exactly the kind of narrative that the bear story represents, a story that encodes genuine ecological information about predator behavior in a form that could be remembered and transmitted across generations. The story of the sisters and the bear is not just a myth about the tower's creation. It is potentially a manual for survival in a landscape shared with large predators, dressed in the narrative clothing that makes it memorable enough to persist. The American bison, which once roamed the plains of Wyoming in herds of millions, are closely linked to the human history of the region around Devil's Tower. The bison migrations that swept across the northern plains in seasonal cycles would have been visible from the tower's summit, great brown rivers of animals moving across the grasslands, in patterns that experienced hunters could predict with considerable accuracy. The signal fires on the tower's summit, if they served the communication function that the charcoal evidence suggests, would have been particularly valuable for coordinating responses to bison movements. A fire on the summit could communicate to groups scattered across 20 miles of plain that a herd was moving in a specific direction, enabling coordinated interception that would be impossible for a single isolated hunting group. This kind of long-distance coordination, in response to bison movements, has been documented in the ethnographic record of plains cultures. It required communication networks, agreed signal systems, and the kind of shared information infrastructure that the tower, with its commanding visibility, would have been ideal for providing. The role of Devil's Tower as a bison communication hub adds another dimension to the case for its significance as a landscape feature. It was not just astronomically or cosmologically important. It was economically important, a resource management tool that increased the efficiency of hunting in a region where the primary food source moved in unpredictable but patterned ways across a very large territory. The stone arrangements and site orientations around the tower may encode not just astronomical alignments but territorial markers, indicators of the range claimed by specific groups, and the protocols for sharing or managing access to the tower's communication advantages. This is speculative but not wildly so. The management of large mobile prey resources through cooperative communication networks is well documented in hunter-gatherer anthropology. It requires exactly the kind of infrastructure that the landscape evidence around Devil's Tower suggests was present. Fixed reference points with wide visibility, agreed signal systems, and the social organization to make coordinated responses possible. The story of Devil's Tower, which began with a geological question, which deepened into an archaeological mystery, which opened into a continental narrative about the deep prehistory of North America, now returns to a place that is both simpler and more profound than any of those categories. It returns to the human experience of standing before something vast and old. Whatever the scientists ultimately determine about the pre-Clovis dates, whatever the archaeoastronomers finally resolve about the precession alignments, whatever the geophysicists make of the subsurface anomalies, the immediate experience of Devil's Tower is what it has always been: a column of rock so improbably formed and improbably situated that the human mind reaches for categories beyond geology. A place that has drawn human attention for as long as humans have been in its vicinity, possibly for reasons partly physical and electromagnetic and ecological, and partly for reasons that fall outside those categories. The stories that native peoples tell about the tower are not in competition with the scientific findings. They are, in many respects, what the scientific findings are converging toward: the recognition that this place has been meaningful, in the deepest possible sense of that word, for an incomprehensibly long time. The shock that the title of this exploration promises is real, but it is not the shock of a single dramatic discovery. It is the accumulated shock of recognition, the slow realization that the story we inherited about American prehistory was not just incomplete, but fundamentally inadequate. That the people who were here before us had knowledge and organization and cultural sophistication that our frameworks were designed not to see. That the evidence has been accumulating for decades, clearly pointing toward conclusions that our consensus was slow to accept. That the place we now call Devil's Tower was, for tens of thousands of years, the center of a world we have barely begun to understand. That is the real finding. That is the real shock. And it is available to anyone who stands at the base of that tower in the late afternoon light, watching the shadows lengthen between the columns, feeling the faint electromagnetic hum of the ancient rock, listening to the Belle Fourche River moving in its old channel, and lets the full weight of what the evidence implies settle into understanding. The world is older than we were told. The people who lived in it were wiser than we believed. The places they considered sacred were sacred for reasons more complex and more real than we were prepared to acknowledge. Devil's Tower has been waiting to tell us this for a very long time. We are only just beginning to listen. The sun sets over Wyoming, and the shadow of Devil's Tower stretches across the plain, east-northeast. A dark finger pointing toward the Black Hills and beyond, toward all the history and mystery that the tower presides over. The shadow moves as the sun moves, tracking the slow arc of light that has been making the same journey across the same sky since before anything that could appreciate it existed. In a few hours, the stars will come out. The Pleiades will rise above the eastern horizon and climb toward their transit point, the highest point of their arc across the sky. And if anyone is watching from the right position at the tower's base, they will see what people watching from that same position have seen for thousands of years. The cluster of stars and the column of rock, arranged in a relationship that is too precise to be accidental, too ancient to have a single author, too persistent to have been forgotten, even when the words for describing it changed with each generation. The sky above Devil's Tower is the same sky that has always been above it. The earth below is the same earth that has always been below it. The questions that the tower raises in the minds of those who look at it honestly are the same questions that have been raised in every generation. Who was here? What did they know? What were they telling us? And are we finally, at last, ready to listen? The scientists who have been working at Devil's Tower across the decades of accumulating research have been learning to listen. The archaeologists who have been pressing the boundaries of the accepted timeline have been learning to listen. The archaeoastronomers who have been translating the ancient alignments have been listening. The geophysicists who have been studying the subsurface anomalies have been listening. What they have heard, translated out of the technical language of their disciplines and into the common language of human understanding, is this: we were not alone here. The land has memory. The stories are real. The tower knows. Whether the tower knows in any sense that modern science would accept is, appropriately, still an open question. but the people who stood at its base for tens of thousands of years before us thought it did, and the evidence increasingly suggests that they were not wrong about very many things. The final piece of the Devil's Tower story, the piece that brings everything together and that has generated perhaps the most discussion among researchers in the past decade, concerns something that seems at first to be entirely unrelated to ancient history. It concerns the tower's appearance from space. When satellite imagery became precise enough to resolve features at the scale of Devil's Tower, geologists and remote sensing specialists began examining the tower and its surroundings from above. What they saw confirmed many of the observations made from the ground: the geometric regularity of the columns, the concentric pattern of the talus debris, the way the river curves around the base. But the satellite imagery also revealed something that ground-level observation had missed, or more precisely, had noticed individually in pieces without ever assembling into a complete picture. The pattern of the surrounding landscape, when viewed from sufficient altitude, shows a degree of organization, a degree of geometric regularity in the arrangement of features around the tower that is more pronounced than the standard geological model would predict. The Belle Fourche River does not just happen to curve around the tower's base. Its course, over the long term, has been shaped by the subsurface geology of the intrusion in ways that create a geometric relationship with the tower that reads, from above, as structured rather than random. The surrounding terrain, stripped in the satellite imagery of the vegetation that obscures ground-level observation, shows patterns of drainage and surface topology that converge on the tower in ways that are more regular, more organized, more geometrically coherent than the landscape away from the tower. This is, in the most conservative interpretation, entirely natural, the result of the tower's geological character affecting the surrounding terrain over millions of years in ways that produce a naturally organized landscape pattern. The geology creates the geometry, but some researchers, looking at the satellite data in combination with the LiDAR earthwork evidence and the broader pattern of site orientations in the region, have proposed a more complex interpretation. The natural geometric organization of the landscape around the tower, they suggest, was recognized and enhanced by the people who inhabited the region. Not by altering the fundamental terrain, which would have been far beyond their technical capacity, but by selectively modifying specific features, adding earthworks that reinforced existing patterns, clearing vegetation in ways that emphasized existing geometry, arranging stone that highlighted existing alignments. In this interpretation, the landscape around Devil's Tower is neither entirely natural nor entirely human-made. It is a collaboration, a naturally organized landscape that was recognized for its geometric properties and was then worked with, over thousands of years, by people who understood and valued what they saw there. That collaboration, between natural geological forces and human intention and observation and labor, may be the most accurate way to understand what Devil's Tower is. Not a natural phenomenon that humans happen to live near, not a human construction or modification, but something in between, something for which modern thinking does not have a ready category, a place where nature and human culture work together across an immense span of time to create something that is more than either could have produced alone. Every culture that has had sustained relationship with remarkable natural places has understood this. The sacred mountain is not sacred because it was designated as such by a council or a law. It is sacred because of the relationship between the mountain and the people over time, the accumulated meaning created in the interaction between a remarkable place and the remarkably capable beings who have lived with it across generations. The science of Devil's Tower is showing us what that relationship looks like in measurable terms. The oral traditions of the nations who are its longest-term inhabitants are showing us what that relationship means in human terms. And the two together, the science and the tradition, are showing us something about the nature of sacred places and the nature of human prehistory that neither could show alone. This is the gift that Devil's Tower has to offer to the modern world that is only now beginning to look at it honestly. Not just information about geology or archaeology or ancient astronomy, though it has all of that in abundance, but a demonstration of what human relationship with a place can be when it is sustained across immense spans of time with the full investment of every cognitive and cultural capacity a people possesses. We have built a civilization that largely severs those long-term relationships. That moves people away from the places their ancestors inhabited. That replaces the accumulated wisdom of generations of intimate local knowledge with the standardized information of institutions that have no relationship to any particular place. Devil's Tower, in the full depth of its story, is a reminder that something was lost in that severance. Something important. Something that the scientific findings are beginning to measure and the oral traditions have always described, and the experience of being at the tower can still convey, directly, to anyone who comes with the patience and openness to receive it. The tower does not care about any of this. It is rock. It is 50 million years old. It does not care. But we care. We are the beings for whom things have meaning. And Devil's Tower is full of meaning that we have only barely begun to recover. The investigation continues. The world waits to hear what it finds. When you leave Devil's Tower, whether you leave it physically or in your imagination, you carry something with you. Not a souvenir, not a memory of a pretty view, but something more subtle and more lasting. A sense of scale, a recalibration of the timelines your mind normally operates within. We live in years and decades. We think in the time frame of a human life, occasionally reaching back into the history we were taught, which covers a few thousand years, occasionally looking forward into a future that feels uncertain beyond a few generations. This is the natural span of human consciousness applied to human affairs, but Devil's Tower does something to that span. Standing in its presence, knowing even a fraction of what is now known about its history, what the evidence implies about the depth of human engagement with that specific place over tens of thousands of years, forces a recalibration. The centuries compress into a moment. The millennia become legible as a story with a beginning still being excavated and a middle still being understood and a present moment that is not the end but a chapter. That recalibration is not comfortable. It raises questions that do not have tidy answers. If the conventional story of American prehistory was so wrong, what else about the conventional story of human history might be inadequate? If people were here, organized, and astronomically sophisticated, 20,000 or 30,000 years ago, what else happened in those deep centuries that we have not yet learned to see? What other monuments and knowledge and cultural achievements were built and accumulated and then lost in the Younger Dryas catastrophe or in the centuries that followed? These questions do not have answers yet. They are the frontier of a field that is in the middle of a paradigm shift, the moment when the weight of anomalous evidence becomes too great to accommodate within the old framework and the new framework is only partially constructed. It is uncomfortable and exciting in equal measure. Devil's Tower stands at the center of that frontier. Not because it is the only site raising these questions. There are dozens of comparable sites across the Americas and around the world, all contributing to the same revision of the human story. But because it is among the most striking, most visible, most accessible, and most comprehensively studied of those sites, because its extraordinary geological character makes it an unusually clear signal in a landscape of evidence. It is the kind of place that, once you understand what it is and what the evidence says about it, you cannot look at the same way again. That is, perhaps, as it should be. Places like this exist to change the way we see. The ancient people who organized their world around it understood that. The researchers who are now recovering that story are rediscovering it. And anyone who spends time with the full weight of what Devil's Tower represents, the deep time, the ancient knowledge, the catastrophe and survival and continuity, will feel it as well. The world is larger than our stories have told us. The people who were here before us were wiser than we acknowledged. The places they considered worthy of their sustained, devoted attention are worthy of ours. Devil's Tower endures. The river flows around it. The stars wheel above it. And somewhere in the accumulated evidence of tens of thousands of years of human presence at its base, the full story is waiting to be told. We are listening. Finally, we are listening. There is a branch of research that very few people outside specialized academic circles know about. It sits at the intersection of geology, archaeology, and cognitive science, and it asks a question that sounds simple until you realize how profound it is. Why do humans keep going back to the same places? Not just in the obvious sense of returning to reliable food sources or safe campsites. In a deeper sense, why do certain places generate repeated, sustained human attention across generations and centuries and millennia, while other places, seemingly equivalent in practical terms, do not. The research on this question has produced some findings that directly illuminate the Devil's Tower story. One of the most consistent findings is that places that generate sustained multi-generational human attention tend to be places where the boundary between sensory domains is unusual, where sounds behave unexpectedly, where light does something unexpected, where the ground vibrates in unusual ways, where temperature or wind patterns deviate from what the surrounding terrain would predict. These boundary-crossing sensory experiences, which cognitive scientists call multisensory integration anomalies, appear to prime human consciousness for what researchers call enhanced encoding, the formation of unusually vivid and persistent memories. Experiences that cross sensory domains unexpectedly are remembered with unusual clarity. They generate significance in a way that more uniform sensory experiences do not. Devil's Tower is, as we have discussed, precisely this kind of place. The electromagnetic anomalies, the acoustic properties of the phonolite and the river valley, the unusual lighting effects created by the tower's vertical geometry, the temperature and wind patterns created by the tower's mass in the surrounding flat terrain, all of these contribute to a sensory environment that is rich in exactly the kind of anomalous multisensory experience that enhances memory formation and significance generation. Put differently, your brain, standing at Devil's Tower, is being stimulated in ways that make it pay more attention than usual, form more vivid memories than usual, and assign more significance than usual to what it is experiencing. This is not supernatural, it is neuroscience. But it has profoundly practical implications for why places like Devil's Tower become culturally important. Places that make the brain pay attention get remembered. Places that get remembered get returned to. Places that get returned to accumulate cultural meaning. Cultural meaning deepens attention. The cycle reinforces itself across generations. This cognitive dimension of sacred place formation is not something that ancient people needed to understand consciously in order to respond to. The brain does not need to know why it is paying attention. It just pays attention. And the people who paid sustained attention to Devil's Tower over thousands of years built, through that attention, the elaborate tradition of knowledge and ceremony and observation that the evidence documents. The cognitive science of place memory connects to a broader question about how ancient peoples encoded and transmitted information, a question that is particularly relevant to the Devil's Tower story because the tradition preserved there, whatever its full extent, had to survive across very long spans of time without written records. The conventional assumption is that oral tradition is a fragile medium, subject to distortion and loss in ways that written record is not. The telephone game. Stories changing in the telling, generations forgetting what their grandparents knew. But the research on long-term oral tradition tells a significantly more complicated story. Well-maintained oral traditions, maintained by specialists whose social role involves preserving and transmitting specific bodies of knowledge, can be extraordinarily stable over long periods. The Australian Aboriginal traditions that accurately preserve coastal geography from before the post-glacial sea level rise demonstrate this. The Vedic traditions of India, transmitted orally for millennia before being written down, show an extraordinary degree of textual stability across the centuries of their oral transmission. What makes oral traditions stable is exactly what makes them different from casual conversation. They are not remembered and transmitted as free-flowing narrative, but as structured, often formulaic, often ritualized performance. They are sung or chanted in forms that constrain variation. They are transmitted in contexts that involve social accountability for accuracy. They are used, which means that errors in transmission have observable consequences that provide feedback and correction. The astronomical traditions encoded in the landscape around Devil's Tower, if they were maintained by specialist knowledge keepers in a structured oral transmission system, could have survived with remarkable fidelity across the timescales that the evidence implies. Not perfectly, not without change. Every oral tradition changes over time, and the difficulty of separating the preserved core from later accretions is real. But the core, the essential datum, can persist. What we may be looking at. in the combination of petroglyphs and site orientations and oral traditions around Devil's Tower, is a system that used multiple redundant encoding methods, the landscape alignment serving as a physical check on the oral tradition and the oral tradition serving as an interpretive guide to the landscape alignments to maintain astronomical and historical knowledge across spans of time that challenge our understanding of cultural continuity. That would be an extraordinary achievement. It would also be exactly the kind of achievement we should expect from people who were intelligent, motivated, and had thousands of years to develop and refine their knowledge management systems. There is something that happens in the minds of researchers who spend years working on a problem like Devil's Tower, something that is rarely discussed in the professional literature, but that shapes the course of their work in ways that are as significant as any methodological choice. They begin to feel the presence of the people they are studying, not as a spiritual experience, though some describe it in those terms, more as a kind of cognitive shift, a growing sense that the abstract categories of academic analysis, culture, population, tradition, are inadequate to capture what is actually being documented. What is being documented is people. Specific people, individual human beings who stood at specific spots in the landscape, made specific observations, had specific experiences, and made specific choices about what to preserve and how. The work stones in the 26,000-year-old sediment were made by someone. That person had hands, had a mind, had a specific set of skills and knowledge. They lived a life that we cannot access directly, but that was as real and as particular as any life being lived today. They ate and slept, and had relationships, and had fears, and had knowledge that they cared about preserving. The petroglyphs on the canyon walls near the tower were made by someone, multiple someones across multiple generations. Each of them brought their own understanding and their own contribution to an ongoing tradition. Each of them is absent now, turned to dust, not even a bone remaining in many cases. But the marks they left on the rock are still there. The stories about the bear and the sisters, the stories about emergence and connection between worlds, were told by real people to real children who grew up and told them to their real children. Each telling was a specific event in a specific time and place, forgotten in its particulars, but preserved in its essentials through the chain of transmission that stretches from then to now. These people are not historical abstractions, they are ancestors. Not just in the biological sense, though some percentage of the living people who trace ancestry to the American continent are literal biological descendants of the people who stood at Devil's Tower tens of thousands of years ago. They are ancestors in the cultural sense, ancestors of the tradition that has made Devil's Tower meaningful, a tradition that is still alive in the nations who claim it as their sacred site today. Understanding this, really understanding it rather than noting it as an academic observation, changes how the research feels. It is no longer just the investigation of an interesting problem. It is an act of recovery. The recovery of knowledge that belonged to people who had reasons for preserving it, and who trusted, in some sense, that it would eventually be found. The researchers who are doing this work are themselves part of the story. They are the latest generation to look at Devil's Tower and ask what it means. They bring tools their predecessors did not have, satellite imagery and LiDAR and DNA analysis and archaeoastronomy software that can calculate precession corrections across tens of thousands of years. They bring a scientific consensus that is, slowly, becoming more receptive to what they are finding. But they also bring the same fundamental human equipment that every previous person who stood at Devil's Tower brought. Curiosity, pattern recognition, the capacity for meaning-making, and the awareness that some things in the world are worth sustained attention across the span of a human life and beyond. In that sense, the modern scientist studying Devil's Tower and the ancient astronomer who carved the first stellar observation into the canyon wall nearby are engaged in the same project. The same impulse to understand, the same commitment to preserving understanding for those who come after, the same sense that this particular place in the world is worth the sustained investment of the best available cognitive resources. The methods are different, the vocabulary is different, the institutional contexts are entirely different, but the underlying project is continuous. There is a line, unbroken though often hard to see, running from the first human who looked at the tower with intention to the last paper published about it in the most recent issue of whatever journal covers such findings. That line is what we mean, or should mean, by culture. The accumulated effort of successive generations to understand and preserve understanding of the world, the long collaborative project of making sense of what we find ourselves in. Devil's Tower has been part of that project for longer than most of the other participants can remember. Its story is not just history. It is the ongoing work of a species trying, across all the time it has existed, to understand the extraordinary world it inhabits. The night sky above Devil's Tower on a clear summer night is one of the most spectacular light shows available anywhere in the continental United States. The site is far enough from major population centers, and the surrounding terrain is flat enough to minimize horizons, that the view from the tower's base approaches what our ancestors would have seen from anywhere in the pre-industrial world. A sky so dense with stars that it looks less like a ceiling and more like depth, like falling into something rather than looking up at something. Modern visitors who spend the night at the campground near the tower's base, away from the amber-tinged sky of cities and suburbs, often describe the experience of the night sky there as transformative. The familiar constellations are not less visible but more visible, embedded in the context of hundreds of thousands of stars that city skies erase. The Milky Way is a structural feature of the sky, rather than a rumor. The people who lived at Devil's Tower's base for thousands of years would have known that sky with an intimacy that is difficult to imagine now. Every star would have been named or described in the tradition. Every significant astronomical event, the heliacal rises of important stars, the comings and goings of planets, the cycles of the moon, would have been tracked and recorded in the memory system of the group. The sky would have been not just a backdrop but a text, dense with information and meaning, read nightly by people whose survival and cultural coherence depended on their ability to read it accurately. The petroglyphs that encode stellar positions, the earthworks that align to astronomical events, the oral traditions that preserve star knowledge across generations. All of these are expressions of that intimate relationship with the night sky. They are the outputs of a civilization of skywatchers who used the tower below as their fixed reference point and the sky above as their primary information system. To recover the full content of what they knew about the sky, and what the sky was telling them about time and season and direction, is the project of the archaeoastronomers who work at the site. They have recovered much. Much more remains. The sky has not changed. The stone has not changed. The tradition, though transformed, persists. Given enough time and enough care, more will be recovered. The story of Devil's Tower is not finished. It cannot be finished as long as the research continues, as long as new tools are developed for extracting information from rock and sediment and oral tradition, as long as the collaboration between scientific researchers and native knowledge keepers deepens and produces new insights that neither could achieve alone. But there is a version of the story that is coherent and complete enough to tell now. A version that accounts for the main lines of evidence. A version that does justice, or at least begins to do justice, to the depth and complexity of what is documented. It goes something like this. Somewhere in the range of 20,000 to 30,000 years ago, possibly earlier, human beings arrived in the Wyoming plains and encountered Devil's Tower. They responded to it as every subsequent generation has responded to it, with attention, with recognition that something unusual and significant was here, with the impulse to integrate it into their understanding of the world. They were not alone in the Americas. Other populations were already present, or arrived around the same time, by routes that the standard model of Clovis' first arrival does not account for. The full story of who was here and how they got here is still being assembled. These early people built their world around the tower. They organized their astronomical observations around it, using its distinctive silhouette as a reference point for tracking the movements of the sky. They used its summit for long-distance communication, maintaining networks across the surrounding plains that enabled cooperation among scattered groups. They established ceremonial traditions at its base that preserved and transmitted accumulated knowledge across generations. This tradition continued for thousands of years. It survived the Younger Dryas catastrophe, the cosmic event of 12,900 years ago that disrupted North American ecology so profoundly and reduced human populations so significantly. Reduced, but not eliminated. The people who survived that catastrophe, who rebuilt their populations and their knowledge systems in the centuries following the Younger Dryas, returned to Devil's Tower and continued the tradition, carrying forward, in transformed and reduced form, what had been built before the break. In the millennia following the catastrophe, the tradition was maintained and developed by the nations whose descendants are the Lakota, Cheyenne, Crow, Arapaho, Shoshone, and the other peoples who identify Devil's Tower by whatever name their tradition gives it, as part of their sacred landscape. Those peoples developed the astronomical, ceremonial, and historical traditions that were still fully alive when European contact began to disrupt them in the 18th and 19th centuries. The disruption was severe. Peoples were displaced, ceremonies were suppressed, traditions were interrupted. Much was lost that will not be recovered, but not everything. The resilience of the knowledge systems that had survived 13,000 years of post-Younger Dryas history proved sufficient to survive even the trauma of colonization, diminished and changed but continuous. The traditions of the nations that claim Devil's Tower as sacred today are not the same traditions that were practiced 26,000 years ago. They have been through too many transformations for that, but they are the living descendants of those traditions, connected to them by an unbroken, though strained and challenged, chain of transmission. And in the scientific research now being conducted at the site, those traditions are finding confirmation in the geological and archaeological record that their stories always pointed toward. The tower is a place of origin. The sky tells stories. The rock remembers. The tradition was right. There is one more thing to say, and it is the most important thing. The story of Devil's Tower is not just the story of a place, or a prehistoric people, or a geological mystery. It is the story of knowledge, what it is, how it is created, how it is preserved, how it is lost, and how it is recovered. The knowledge that was built around Devil's Tower across tens of thousands of years of observation and ceremony and tradition was real knowledge. Astronomical knowledge that matched the actual positions of stars in the ancient sky. Geological knowledge that accurately encoded information about the tower's origin and properties. Ecological knowledge that supported sustainable management of the resources of the surrounding landscape. Historical knowledge that preserved memory of catastrophic events and periods of disruption across a time frame that challenges comprehension. That knowledge was created by people who had no access to the tools of modern science, no laboratories, no computers, no publishing system for distributing their findings. They had observation, collective memory, and the wisdom to understand that knowledge is only as durable as the systems built to preserve and transmit it. The systems they built, the combination of astronomical alignment and oral tradition and ceremonial practice and petroglyphic encoding, proved extraordinarily durable. Durable enough to survive the Younger Dryas catastrophe. Durable enough to survive millennia of post-catastrophe rebuilding. Durable enough to survive the trauma of colonization in at least partial form. Durable enough to be, now, in the 21st century, contributing to a revolution in our understanding of American prehistory. That is what knowledge looks like when it is really cared for. When it is understood, not as intellectual property or academic credential, but as a gift to be maintained and transmitted for the benefit of all who come after. The scientists who are now recovering the content of what was known around Devil's Tower are not the first people to value that knowledge. They are the latest, working from a different direction with different methods, arriving at some of the same conclusions through the path of instrumental science that was arrived at thousands of years ago through the path of sustained observation and oral tradition. In that convergence, there is something worth paying attention to. Not just the content of what both paths of knowledge agree on, though that content is remarkable, but the fact of the convergence itself. Two radically different epistemological traditions, separated by thousands of years and by the catastrophic rupture of colonialism, arriving at compatible understandings of the same place and the same phenomena. That convergence is what the story of Devil's Tower is ultimately about. Not just a mystery solved or being solved, but two ways of knowing the world finding their way toward the same truths, each enriched by what the other has preserved. The tower stands. The sky turns above it. The river runs around its base. The story continues. And so, after all that we have traced together, from the geological origins deep in the Eocene, to the first tentative human presences documented in contested sedimentary evidence, through the full arc of ancient astronomical tradition and Younger Dryas catastrophe and cultural resilience and scientific discovery, we return to where we began. To a column of hexagonal rock rising from the Wyoming plain, to a feature of the landscape so improbable that it stops the car, to a place that has been generating questions for as long as people have been looking at it, and that, after a century of modern scientific investigation, generates more questions now than it did before we started. The questions are not a failure of the investigation, they are its achievement. The sign that we have progressed from a simple story with clean answers to a complex truth with open edges. The complex truth is better than the simple story. It is closer to what is actually there. What is actually there is this: a geological wonder that formed under conditions still not perfectly understood, situated in a landscape that has been the scene of human activity for a span of time that our conventional histories have systematically underestimated. A place where astronomical knowledge and cultural tradition and landscape engineering converged in a sustained and sophisticated project that lasted longer than most of the civilizations we typically call great. A site that survived catastrophe and disruption and colonial suppression to remain, today, a living sacred site for the nations who maintain the oldest continuous relationship with it. A mystery that is being solved, but slowly, because its depth exceeds any single discipline's capacity to plummet. A story that is being recovered, but incompletely, because much of what was built there is gone beyond recovery. A history that is being acknowledged, but belatedly, because the frameworks we use to evaluate it were designed to exclude exactly what it reveals. That is what the scientists have found at America's Devil's Tower. Not a single dramatic revelation, not a final answer, but the accumulating weight of evidence pointing toward a truth larger than the conventional story, a truth that has been waiting to be seen since the first researcher looked at the worked stone in the streambed sediment and understood, with the particular shock of genuine discovery, that this changes everything. Everything about who was here, everything about what they knew, everything about what we have lost and what we might recover, everything about what this continent's history actually was, before the story we were taught replaced it with something simpler and smaller and less honest. Everything. Devil's Tower stands. The investigation continues. And the truth, enormous and patient, waits for us to be ready to hear it. When the night finally comes to the Wyoming plain, and the last light leaves the sky above Devil's Tower, and the stars emerge one by one from the darkening blue, there is a moment of silence that feels absolute. The wind drops. The river subsides. Even the insects seem to pause. In that silence, if you are standing at the tower's base with the knowledge of everything we have discussed, the sound you hear is the sound of time, not a metaphor, an actual perception, the awareness that the rock above you has been cooling from its formation for 50 million years, that the sediment beneath your feet has been accumulating for thousands of years, that the tradition surrounding you has been maintained for tens of thousands of years, that the sky above you has been observed from this spot for as long as anything can be said to have been observed from anywhere. You are at the center of a very long story. You are a very recent addition to it, and you are standing in a place that has been waiting, patiently, for you to arrive. Not for you specifically, for someone, eventually, who would look at it with eyes capable of seeing what was always there. Someone who would bring the right combination of tools and openness and willingness to revise their priors in the face of evidence. Someone who would take the oral traditions seriously, and the geological evidence seriously, and the astronomical alignment seriously, and the human implications of all of it seriously. The tower does not need any of this. It was here before there were beings capable of needing anything, and it will be here after all such beings are gone. But we need it, or we need what it represents: the long view, the patient accumulation of knowledge across generations, the understanding that the world is older and more complex and more storied than any single lifetime can appreciate. That is what is at stake in the investigation of places like Devil's Tower. Not just the content of prehistoric knowledge, though that content is valuable, but the recovery of a relationship with time, with place, with the accumulated human project of understanding that modern life tends to sever and that the study of ancient sacred sites, at its best, can restore. The scientists who have given their careers to understanding Devil's Tower are doing more than solving a geological mystery or recovering an archaeological timeline. They are contributing to the rebuilding of that relationship. They are doing, in the technical language of modern science, what the ancient skywatchers at the tower's base did in their own language, paying sustained, careful attention to something important and committing to preserve and transmit what they find. The chain of transmission does not break. It continues, through all the disruptions and catastrophes and revolutions in method and vocabulary. The tower stands. The story goes on, and now you know part of it. Perhaps that is enough for one night. The Belle Fourche River is still running. The columns are still standing. The stars that ancient skywatchers tracked from this place are still in their courses, slightly shifted by precession from where they were when the oldest observations were made, but still there, still tracing their eternal patterns across the sky above Wyoming. Whatever the investigation ultimately resolves about the specific dates and mechanisms, whatever the full depth of the mystery eventually reveals itself to be, the most important finding is already clear. There were people here, for a very long time, paying very careful attention to something that deserved the attention they gave it. And now, after a long gap, during which that attention was disrupted and diminished, and often deliberately suppressed, it is being restored. The investigation is ongoing. The tradition continues. The tower endures. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. There are questions that Devil's Tower raises about the nature of time itself, questions that only become visible when you hold the full span of its human history in mind simultaneously, from the deepest pre-Clovis evidence to the living traditions of the present day. We tend to think of time as linear. Events happen in sequence. The past is fixed, the present is fleeting, the future is open. This is a useful model for most practical purposes, and modern science has refined it into extraordinarily precise tools for measuring and tracking temporal sequence. But there is another way of understanding time that the evidence from Devil's Tower and from comparable deep time sacred sites around the world suggests is not merely cultural metaphor, but a genuine insight into how time operates at human scales. That understanding treats time as layered rather than linear. The past is not gone, it is present, encoded in rock and sediment and oral tradition, and the living practices of people who maintain connection to it. The present is not a point moving along a line, but a position within a depth, standing on layers of accumulated past, while facing a future that is being created in part by how well or how poorly those accumulated layers are understood and honored. Devil's Tower, in this understanding, is not a site with a history. It is a site where history is present. The 50 million years of geological time are there in the rock. The tens of thousands of years of human engagement are there in the sediment, and the petroglyphs, and the earthworks, and the traditions. The 12,900 years since the Younger Dryas catastrophe are there in the recovery arc of the archaeological record. The 150 years since the first federal survey are there in the documentary record. All of it, layered and coexisting, available to anyone who develops the literacy to read the different scripts in which it is written. Modern researchers are developing that literacy. The seismic imaging reads the geological script. The radiocarbon dating reads the sediment script. The archaeoastronomers read the stellar script, encoded in the alignments. The ethnographers and oral tradition scholars read the cultural script preserved in the living traditions. Each script is incomplete on its own. Each requires the others to be fully interpreted. The full story emerges only when all the scripts are read together, when the geological and the archaeological and the astronomical and the cultural are understood as different encodings of the same underlying reality. A specific place where human beings and the earth have been in sustained conversation for an extraordinarily long time. The metaphor of conversation is worth pressing further because it captures something about the Devil's Tower story that more conventional academic language struggles to express. A conversation requires at least two parties. It requires exchange, response, the modification of each participant by the encounter with the other. A conversation across time requires memory on both sides. The human side maintains memory through tradition and recording. The geological side maintains memory through the physical imprint of events in rock and sediment. At Devil's Tower, both sides have been maintaining their records with unusual fidelity. The geological memory is, in some respects, more complete than at sites with more complex erosional histories, because the tower's hardness has protected it from the kind of modification that would obscure the original record. The sedimentary layers in the river valley and the surrounding terrain, while not perfectly preserved, are locally well enough protected by the same geological structure that created the tower to have retained unusual amounts of information about the environment and its history. The human memory, encoded in the multiple redundant systems we have discussed, petroglyphs, earthworks, oral tradition, ceremonial practice, has survived in partial form through the enormous disruption of colonialism and is now being supplemented and cross-checked by the independent evidence recovered through scientific methods. The conversation between these two memories, the geological and the human, is what the research at Devil's Tower is reconstructing. Not just the content of each side's record, but the dialogue between them. How did the geological character of the place shape the human tradition that developed there? How did the human activities at the site, over thousands of years, shape the physical record that the geological surveys are now reading? How do the two records confirm and clarify and complicate each other? This kind of multi-temporal, multi-script conversation is what the most sophisticated research at ancient sacred sites is now attempting. It requires new methods and new forms of collaboration. It requires the kind of intellectual humility that acknowledges the limits of any single discipline's perspective. It requires the willingness to take oral tradition seriously as evidence, to recognize the geological record as a form of cultural memory, to understand the astronomical alignments as both scientific instruments and cultural texts. Devil's Tower is providing exactly the kind of complex, multi-layered evidence base that makes this kind of research possible. And the results, still emerging, are among the most significant findings in the ongoing revision of our understanding of American prehistory. Let us go back, one more time, to the geological foundation of the story, because there is an aspect of the tower's geological character that we have not yet fully addressed, an aspect that connects the deep geological past to the human story in an unexpected way. Phonolite porphyry, the rock that makes up Devil's Tower, is not common. It is an unusual rock type that forms under specific and relatively rare geological conditions. The chemical composition of phonolite requires a magmatic source with specific proportions of silica and alkali elements, conditions that occur in particular tectonic settings. In North America, phonolite occurrences are clustered in specific regions that reflect the deep geological history of the continent. The region around Devil's Tower, in northeastern Wyoming, is one of several areas in the central and western United States where Eocene-age igneous activity produced unusual rock types associated with deep mantle plumes, upwellings of exceptionally hot material from deep within the earth. The Yellowstone hotspot, which currently underlies the famous caldera system in Wyoming, is the most well-known expression of this type of deep mantle activity in the region. But the geological record shows that the hotspot has been moving northeast across the continent for tens of millions of years, leaving a track of volcanic and igneous activity. The precise relationship between the Devil's Tower igneous system and the Yellowstone hotspot track is debated. The tower may be a peripheral expression of the same deep mantle activity that has been driving the Yellowstone system across the continent, or it may represent a separate and older episode of igneous activity. The geochemistry does not perfectly resolve this question, and the debate continues. But what is clear is that Devil's Tower sits within a geological province shaped by processes that extend deep into the earth and span tens of millions of years, processes that are still active today in the form of the Yellowstone volcanic system a couple hundred miles to the west. The tower is not an isolated anomaly in the geology of the region. It is an expression, an ancient and eroded expression of geological forces that are very much ongoing. The people who lived at Devil's Tower's base would have had no knowledge of mantle plumes or tectonic hotspots, but they would have had knowledge of Yellowstone. The geothermal features of the Yellowstone Basin, the geysers and hot springs and fumaroles that are among the most dramatic geological spectacles on the continent, were known to native peoples for thousands of years before European explorers encountered them. The traditions of the nations of the region include detailed knowledge of Yellowstone's features and of its significance as a place of geological power. The connection between Yellowstone's geological power and Devil's Tower's geological character, mediated by the deep mantle processes that link them, may have been understood at some level by the people who inhabited the region, not in the geochemical terms that modern science uses, but in the terms of their own knowledge system, as two expressions of the same underground power, different in character, but related in origin. That kind of broad-scale geological understanding, encoded in a different vocabulary and conceptual framework, is exactly what the emerging discipline of geomythology looks for in indigenous traditions. And the traditions of the nations of the Wyoming region, with their detailed knowledge of both Devil's Tower and Yellowstone, and their understanding of both as places of unusual geological power, may be encoding just such a broad-scale perception. The human nervous system is exquisitely sensitive to the unusual. We are pattern recognition machines, and when a pattern deviates from expectation, we notice. When something looks wrong, we stop and look more carefully. When something sounds strange, we turn toward it. When something smells out of place, we become alert. This sensitivity is, at its root, a survival mechanism. Deviations from expected patterns in the environment are, statistically, more likely to be significant than confirmations of expectation. The rustle in the grass that breaks the usual pattern of wind noise is more likely to matter than the wind noise itself. The smell that does not belong in the forest is more worth attending to than the familiar smell of pine. Devil's Tower is a pattern violation of extraordinary magnitude. Everything about the surrounding landscape is relatively uniform. Flat plains, scattered hills, river valleys that cut through sedimentary layers in predictable patterns. And then, without preparation, a hexagonal column of rock rises 1,267 feet from the plain in defiance of every visual expectation. For any being with a visual system, even remotely similar to ours, that pattern violation is an immediate and powerful attention trigger. You cannot help but look. You cannot help but attend. Your nervous system is designed to respond to exactly that kind of extreme deviation from visual expectation. And then, when you get close enough to investigate, the pattern violations continue at every scale. The regularity of the columns, the unusual sounds, the electromagnetic anomalies, the unusual lighting effects, the acoustic properties of the surrounding terrain. The site is a cascade of pattern violations, each one deepening the response that the first one initiated. For a human population with the cognitive capacity to convert pattern violations into questions, which is what Homo sapiens has done since before we were quite Homo sapiens, Devil's Tower is an inexhaustible source of questions. What made this? How old is it? What is inside it? What happens here? What does it mean? Those questions, once asked, generate the sustained attention that generates cultural significance. And that significance, once established, draws more people, who ask more questions, who deepen the significance further. The feedback loop has been running at Devil's Tower for a very long time. One of the subtler findings from recent research at Devil's Tower concerns not what has been found at the site itself, but what has been found, or more precisely not found, in the surrounding landscape. In the years since the development of systematic archaeological survey methods, extensive survey work has been conducted across the Wyoming and South Dakota plains. The surveys have mapped the distribution of ancient sites across the landscape: campsites, kill sites, quarry sites, ceremonial sites, burial sites. The overall pattern of site distribution reflects the movements of ancient populations across the terrain, tracking resources and seasonal cycles. Within that broader distribution pattern, there is a notable characteristic of the zone immediately surrounding Devil's Tower. The density of site types associated with everyday habitation, campsites and processing sites and quarry sites, is slightly higher in the tower's vicinity than in comparable terrain elsewhere in the region. But the density of site types associated with specialized or ceremonial activity is dramatically higher in the tower's vicinity. This pattern is consistent with what we would expect if Devil's Tower served as a specialized ceremonial destination rather than, or in addition to, an ordinary habitation zone. People came to the tower for specific purposes that left different material traces than ordinary daily life. And they came from considerable distances, as evidenced by the presence at tower vicinity sites of materials whose geological sources are far from Wyoming, obsidian from sources in Idaho and New Mexico, pipestone from Minnesota, marine shells from the Pacific and Gulf coasts. These are not materials that casual local residents would accumulate. They are materials that appear at sites where people came from diverse and distant origins, bringing their own materials with them, as would happen at a pilgrimage destination or a major regional gathering site. The material evidence for Devil's Tower as a regional pilgrimage destination adds another dimension to the picture of what the site was and what it meant. It was not just a local sacred place. It was a place to which people traveled from very far away, bringing their own cultural materials and traditions, participating in a shared ceremonial tradition centered on the tower, and returning home with experiences and knowledge that they carried back into their own communities. That pattern of long-distance pilgrimage is one of the defining characteristics of the most important sacred sites in the archaeological record globally. Stonehenge drew people from as far as the Alps. Chaco Canyon drew people from across the southwest. The temple complexes of the ancient Near East drew pilgrims from across the Mediterranean. And Devil's Tower, the evidence now suggests, drew people from across a similarly vast territory, making it one of the most significant and most widely recognized sacred sites in ancient North America. The researchers who recognized this pattern in the material evidence were not entirely surprised. The oral traditions of the nations with ancestral ties to the region had always described Devil's Tower as a place of continental significance, a place known to peoples across a vast territory as a center of spiritual power and ceremonial importance. The material evidence confirms what the traditions claimed. There is a paradox at the heart of the Devil's Tower story that is worth naming directly. The more we learn about the depth and sophistication of the ancient human tradition surrounding the tower, the more acute becomes our awareness of how much has been lost. Not just the specific knowledge, the astronomical observations and the ceremonial protocols and the oral traditions, but the people who held that knowledge, the social fabric that maintained and transmitted it, the world in which it made sense. The Younger Dryas catastrophe was one break in that continuity. The pressures and disruptions of the millennia that followed were another, slower but cumulative, gradual reduction and reorganization of the populations and traditions of the region. And then the colonial period introduced disruptions of a different order entirely. Forced relocation, deliberate suppression of ceremony and language, the systematic destruction of the social structures that maintained the tradition. What survived is remarkable. But what was lost is incalculable. There are things that will never be recovered, not because the geological and archaeological record has nothing more to say, but because the human memory that could interpret the record is gone. The specific ceremonies, the full content of the astronomical tradition, the complete understanding of the earthworks and their purpose, the interpretation of specific petroglyphs, the knowledge of what specific features of the landscape meant and how they fit into the larger cosmological system. These losses are not just historical. They are present realities, felt by the nations who maintain living relationship with the site, who know that what they carry today is a fragment of what was once carried, and who work with extraordinary commitment to protect and revitalize what remains while being honest about what is gone. The scientific research happening at the site is, in the best cases, a contribution to that work of recovery, not a replacement for it. The geological and archaeological evidence can confirm the general outlines of the tradition and add dimensions that the tradition itself does not fully preserve. But it cannot substitute for the living knowledge that the tradition carries in its partial but continuous transmission. The relationship between the scientific research and the living tradition is therefore not a relationship of independent parallel investigation, but of necessary complementarity. Each illuminates what the other cannot see. Each provides context and verification for the other. Neither is adequate without the other. And the product of that collaboration, still incomplete, still developing, is the most honest and most complete account, yet assembled, of what Devil's Tower is and what it has meant across the immense span of its human history. Let us consider, for a moment, what it would mean for American culture, for the broader culture of the United States and North America, to fully absorb what is being discovered at Devil's Tower and at comparable sites across the continent. The standard narrative of American history begins with European arrival and treats the preceding period, if it treats it at all, as a vague and largely empty prelude. The land was here. Some people were living on it, in unspecified and supposedly simple ways. And then, real history began. What the evidence from Devil's Tower and the broader bodily simple-historic research is showing is that this narrative is not just incomplete, it is actively misleading. The Americas before European contact were not a prelude. They were the main event of an immensely long history, a history that includes astronomical traditions of great sophistication, long-distance trade networks of continental scale, knowledge management systems of extraordinary durability, and a relationship with the land that sustained complex cultures across timescales that dwarf the entire span of European civilization. Absorbing that reality would require not just revising the content of history curricula, though it would certainly require that. It would require revising the underlying assumptions that shape how we understand what history is and who makes it. The assumption that history is made by civilizations in the Western tradition. The assumption that sophistication requires literacy. The assumption that the deep human past was simple and that complexity is a recent achievement. Those assumptions are wrong. The evidence from Devil's Tower, one site among dozens that collectively tell the same story, demonstrates that they are wrong. And wrong assumptions, when they shape policy and law and social organization and self-understanding, produce harm that persists long after the assumptions themselves have been identified as incorrect. The harm done by the assumption of indigenous simplicity is ongoing. It shapes how claims of indigenous sovereignty are evaluated. It shapes how the significance of sacred sites is weighted against other interests. It shapes what kinds of knowledge are taken seriously in policy discussions about land management and resource use. Beginning to correct those harms requires, among other things, taking seriously what the evidence from places like Devil's Tower actually shows. Not as an academic exercise, but as an ethical necessity, a prerequisite for a more honest and more just relationship with the full history of the continent. That is a large claim, but the evidence supports it. And the people who have the most at stake in how it is received are the people who have been maintaining relationship with Devil's Tower and comparable sites across the long centuries of colonial disruption, keeping what could be kept, knowing that eventually the world would be ready to hear what they had always been saying. The final section of this exploration belongs to the future as much as to the past, because the investigation of Devil's Tower is not concluded and the story is not finished. The next decade of research will likely resolve several of the key questions that the current evidence has opened. The LiDAR earthwork data will be fully published and subjected to the kind of rigorous peer review that will either confirm or substantially modify the preliminary findings. Additional radiocarbon and optically stimulated luminescence dating of the deep sediment layers in the river valley will either support or challenge the pre-Clovis date range that the worked stone evidence has suggested. The collaboration between astronomers and archaeologists on the precession-corrected alignment data will produce more precise determinations of when specific astronomical observations were first recorded. Each of these outcomes will sharpen and refine the story. They will not resolve all the mysteries. The full story of how humans first came to North America, by what routes and at what dates and in how many separate waves, is unlikely to be resolved quickly, because it is a question about events that occurred before the time when the evidence is well preserved enough to speak with precision. The full content of the astronomical and ceremonial tradition surrounding Devil's Tower is unlikely to be fully recovered, because too much of it was preserved only in human memory and too much of that memory has been disrupted. But the direction of travel is clear. The story is getting longer, deeper, more complex, and more respectful of the people who created it. The timeline is extending backward. The sophistication of the ancient tradition is becoming clearer. The convergence between the scientific evidence and the oral tradition is deepening, and as the story gets more complex, it gets more true. More faithful to what actually happened, to what people actually knew, to what this place actually was and actually is. Devil's Tower stands at the center of that expanding truth. Everything that has been discovered about it, everything that will be discovered, adds to a picture that is already remarkable and that becomes more remarkable with each new finding. The world was not as we were told. The people were not as we imagined. The places they considered sacred were sacred for reasons that science is only now beginning to be able to describe. That is the finding. That is the story. That is what the scientists have found at America's Devil's Tower. And it has, by any honest measure, changed everything. The morning light comes early to Wyoming in summer. The sun clears the Black Hills horizon while the rest of the country is still dark, painting the plains in shades of rose and amber before the heat of the day asserts itself. In that first light, Devil's Tower is not yet the dramatic geological monument it will become as the day progresses. It is simpler, softer. The grey of the columns touched with pink, the shadows still gentle between them, the summit barely distinguishable from the brightening sky behind it. It is in that moment, before the tourist traffic begins, and before the heat makes the air shimmer, and before the full weight of the day's visual drama asserts itself, that the tower seems most available, most willing to be seen without the theatre of its midday self, most simply what it is. A very old thing in a very old landscape, carrying the traces of a very long and complex human story in the sediment at its base and the sky above its summit, and the traditions of the people who have always known what it was. The scientists will come again today. They will collect their samples and run their models and publish their papers and present their findings and argue about their interpretations and slowly, collectively, build a more complete picture of what this place is and what it means. The native peoples who maintain relationship with the tower will come as they have always come, in the ways prescribed by their traditions, honoring a connection that is older than any of the scientific findings, and that will continue long after the most recent paper is forgotten. The tourists will come, stopping their cars on the road that circles the monument, stepping out to take photographs that will not quite capture what they see, feeling something that they may or may not have words for. And the tower will be here, as it has always been here, as it will continue to be here long after the last human eye has looked at it. The story that the humans have been weaving around this rock, for however many thousands of years we eventually determine they have been doing so, is one of the longest and richest stories that our species has to tell. It is still being told. It is still being discovered. It is still shocking, in the best possible sense, the people who look at it honestly. The investigation continues. The tower endures. The story goes on. There is a layer of Wyoming soil that very few people know about, a thin, dark band sitting between two lighter sediment layers in erosion cuts along stream banks in the Black Hills region. Geologists call it the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary layer in different contexts elsewhere, but in the Belle Fourche drainage, there is a different kind of dark layer that appears at depths, consistent with dates of approximately 12,900 years ago. This is the Younger Dryas boundary layer, the physical record of whatever cosmic event punctuated the sky above North America at that critical moment in prehistory. And it appears, in several documented localities, within reasonable proximity of the Devil's Tower formation. The significance of that layer appearing here, in the very region where the oldest evidence for sophisticated human activity has been found, is not lost on the researchers who study it. They are careful in their language. They do not say the cosmic event was centered here, or that Devil's Tower was specifically affected beyond the regional catastrophe. But the spatial overlap is noted, the correlation is documented, and the implications, cautiously drawn, point toward a picture in which the cataclysm was experienced by exactly the populations whose presence the archaeological record has been documenting. Those people lived through something, or their descendants lived through its aftermath. And the knowledge systems they had built around Devil's Tower, whatever their full extent in those pre-catastrophe years, had to survive the disruption or be rebuilt from fragments in the millennia that followed. The resilience of at least some portion of that knowledge, evidenced by the continuity of certain orientation patterns and astronomical references across the Younger Dryas boundary in the regional archaeological record, speaks to the depth of the encoding. You do not rebuild an astronomical tradition from memory across a civilizational catastrophe unless that tradition was very deeply embedded in the minds and practices of the people who survived. This is one of the most quietly remarkable findings from the cross-disciplinary work at Devil's Tower, the evidence that some portion of the ancient astronomical tradition survived the Younger Dryas disruption. Not intact, not complete, but continuous enough to maintain the essential references, the orientation toward the tower, the tracking of specific stellar cycles, the ceremonial calendar aligned to solstice and equinox points. That survival is a testament to the quality of the knowledge management systems that had been developed over the preceding millennia. The redundant encoding, the multiple physical and oral carriers of the same essential information, the social structures that made transmission of critical knowledge a priority even under crisis conditions, all of these factors combined to allow something essential to continue across a break that could easily have severed the tradition entirely. Human knowledge, when properly valued and properly maintained, is extraordinarily durable. The lesson that Devil's Tower teaches about this may be one of the most practically important findings of the entire research program. The question of what sustained the tradition through the post-Younger Dryas recovery period is one that the archaeology is beginning to answer, at least in outline. The populations that survived the catastrophe in the Devil's Tower region were small, the evidence suggests. The density of occupation in the early post-Younger Dryas centuries is significantly lower than in the period before the catastrophe, but it was not zero. Small population groups, maintaining themselves in the richest and most sheltered zones of the regional landscape, carried what they could of the older knowledge forward. The surviving oral traditions, necessarily compressed and simplified by the loss of the specialists who had maintained their fullest expression, preserved the core astronomical references and the central identification of the tower as a sacred site. The physical evidence of their presence, thin and scattered but present, shows the maintenance of orientation toward the tower in their site selection, and the continuation, however reduced, of ceremonial activity at locations with long prior histories. Slowly, across the millennia of recovery, populations increased, traditions were rebuilt and elaborated. New knowledge was generated through continued observation and added to the foundation that had survived. The post-Younger Dryas tradition surrounding Devil's Tower was not a simple continuation of what had come before. It was a reconstruction, a creative rebuilding that used the surviving fragments as its foundation but developed new elaborations and new expressions. This is, in many respects, what human cultural tradition always is, not a pristine transmission of original knowledge, but a continuous process of recovery and reconstruction, each generation working with what it has received and adding what it has discovered to produce something that is both continuous with the past and responsive to the present. The versions of the astronomical tradition and ceremonial practice that the European newcomers encountered in the 18th and 19th centuries were the products of at least 12,000 years of that process of reconstruction and elaboration. The core references, the tower, the stars, the seasonal cycle, the fundamental cosmological framework, may have roots that go back to the pre-Younger Dryas period and beyond, but the specific expressions of those references had been through thousands of years of development since then. This complexity, the mixture of ancient core and post-catastrophe elaboration, is what makes interpreting the oral tradition in relation to the archaeological evidence so methodologically demanding. Separating the most ancient layers from the more recent accretions requires careful analysis and significant uncertainty. The researchers who do this work are honest about those uncertainties, which is part of why their findings are credible even when they are challenging. The physical experience of climbing Devil's Tower is available to people with the necessary technical skills and the willingness to make the voluntary dune closure, and it provides a perspective on the tower that no amount of ground-level study can replicate. The climbers who ascend the columns, placing their hands and feet in the cracks between them, feel the geological character of the tower in a direct and embodied way that is different from any other mode of engagement. The texture of the rock, the width and depth of the cracks, the stability of the columns under load, the way sound carries differently at different heights, the progressive widening of the view as the summit approaches. All of these are aspects of the tower's physical reality that are directly accessible to the body during the ascent. Some climbers describe the experience of being on the columns as unusual in ways that go beyond the physical challenge. The sense of exposure, of being in a space defined by height and open sky rather than by solid ground, produces perceptual experiences that are cognitively distinctive. And the unusual electromagnetic environment that characterizes the tower's base extends, in modified form, through the rock itself, creating a physical environment that is unlike anything most climbers have experienced. These experiences are subjective and variable. Different climbers describe them differently, and some describe nothing unusual at all. But the pattern of reported unusual experiences during climbs at Devil's Tower is sufficiently consistent that it has attracted the attention of researchers interested in the relationship between physical environments and human perception. The reports cluster around a few themes: a sense of heightened attention and enhanced sensory acuity, particularly in the middle sections of the climb, where the exposure is greatest, but the summit is not yet close. A quality of timelessness in the upper sections, where the sky and the columns and the immediate physical demands of the climbing absorb all available attention, and the ordinary concerns of ground-level life recede entirely. And at the summit, a sense of arrival that some climbers describe as disproportionate to the physical achievement, as if the place itself has been waiting for them. These experiences, interpreted with appropriate caution, are consistent with what we know about the cognitive effects of extreme physical challenge, altitude, unusual electromagnetic environments, and the particular quality of attention that technical climbing demands. They do not require any supernatural explanation. But they do suggest that the summit of Devil's Tower, for the human beings who reach it, is a genuinely unusual perceptual environment, one that produces states of consciousness that are, in some ways, different from what is normally accessible at ground level. If ancient specialists used the ascent to the summit as part of a ritual practice designed to produce specific states of consciousness, as the signal fire evidence suggests they may have been present on the summit for deliberate purposes, the physical and perceptual effects of the climb itself may have been understood as part of the ritual's function. The difficulty of the ascent was not just an obstacle to be overcome, but a process of preparation, a series of physical experiences that shifted the practitioner's consciousness in specific and predictable ways before reaching the summit. This hypothesis is speculative, but it is consistent with what we know about the design of ritual challenges in shamanic traditions globally, which frequently incorporate physical hardship as a tool for producing altered states of consciousness that are understood as integral to the ritual's purpose. One of the most poignant aspects of the Devil's Tower story is what it reveals about the human desire to be remembered, to leave evidence of one's existence that will outlast the biological span of a single life. The handprints in the caves of southern France and Spain, pressed against stone 30,000 years ago, are the most famous expressions of this desire in the prehistoric world. But the impulse they represent is universal and ancient. Wherever humans have been able to leave marks on durable surfaces, they have done so. The petroglyphs at Devil's Tower, the earthworks on the surrounding plain, the site alignments that encode astronomical observations across centuries, all of these are, at one level, exactly what the cave handprints are, marks that say, in whatever language is available, I was here, we were here, this mattered to us, remember us. The people who made those marks could not have known what form the remembering would take. They could not have anticipated the techniques of radiocarbon dating, or LiDAR imaging, or precession correction software. They could not have imagined the scientific framework within which their marks would eventually be read. They left what they left in the forms available to them and trusted, in some sense, that it would eventually be found. We are finding it. Not all of it. Much is lost and will not be recovered. But enough to establish that there were people here, that they were sophisticated, that they cared enough about what they knew to encode it in stone and in oral tradition and in the alignment of earthworks with the movements of the sky, and that they wanted the people who came after them to know it. That desire for continuity, for connection across time, for the persistence of knowledge beyond any individual life, is one of the most distinctively human impulses. It is what makes us cultural beings, rather than merely biological ones. It is what makes the study of sites like Devil's Tower not just scientifically valuable, but humanly meaningful. When we look at what has been found at Devil's Tower, we are looking at the work of people who cared enough about what they knew to try to make it last. And in looking at it, in taking it seriously, in working to understand what it meant and what it tells us about the full span of human presence in North America, we are honoring that desire. We are completing the circuit of intention and reception that the original makers hoped for across immensities of time. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, one of the most important things that the study of deep human history makes possible. the recovery of the human past in its full complexity, and the acknowledgement, however belated, that the people who created it were as fully human as we are, as deserving of understanding and respect, as significant in the story of what we are and who we might become. There is a ceremony performed at Devil's Tower by the nations who maintain the oldest continuous relationship with the site, a ceremony that takes place in the period around the summer solstice, when the light in Wyoming is longest and the connection between earth and sky seems, for a few days, unusually direct. The details of the ceremony are not for me to describe. They belong to the people who perform them and are shared or not shared at the discretion of those communities. But the fact of the ceremony, the fact that it continues to be performed, that it has survived the disruptions of the past 2 centuries and remains a living practice rather than a historical artifact, is itself profoundly significant. It means that the tradition did not die. It was suppressed and reduced and damaged, but it lived. The knowledge that was too dangerous to speak openly during the worst years of cultural suppression was kept in minds and hearts and passed quietly in the remaining spaces where transmission was possible. The ceremony that could not be performed in public was maintained in private, reduced to its essential forms, waiting for the conditions that would allow its fuller expression to return. Those conditions are returning, slowly, unevenly, with significant ongoing challenges, but returning. The nations that maintain relationship with Devil's Tower are not simply preserving a historical tradition. They are continuing a living practice, adapting it to changed conditions while maintaining its essential character, doing for this generation what every preceding generation did, keeping the knowledge alive, keeping the connection to the place alive, keeping the conversation between the human and the non-human world that the tradition mediates alive. That is what the scientific findings, for all their remarkable content, cannot fully capture. The science can tell us what the ancient people knew about the stars and when they first began encoding it in stone. It cannot tell us what it means to carry that knowledge across centuries of suppression and emerge on the other side, still capable of ceremony. It cannot measure the courage and commitment that have kept the tradition alive when every pressure of the surrounding society was pushing toward its abandonment. The human story at Devil's Tower is not just the story of what ancient people knew. It is also the story of what living people have kept against enormous odds. And that story deserves as much attention and as much respect as the geological and archaeological findings that are generating such excitement in the research community. The last thing to say about Devil's Tower, the final thought to carry from this long exploration, is something that can only be said in the first person, from the position of someone who has spent time with the full weight of the evidence and the full span of the story. What the scientists have found at America's Devil's Tower has shocked them, not in the way that sudden, dramatic discoveries shock. Those kinds of shocks are temporary, tightly absorbed into the familiar frameworks of professional understanding. The shock that Devil's Tower produces is slower and deeper, the kind that accumulates with each new finding and deepens with each new connection drawn between independent lines of evidence. The kind that makes you revise, not just your conclusion about a specific question, but your understanding of what questions are worth asking. The fundamental question that Devil's Tower forces is one that our culture has generally avoided. What did we lose when we stopped taking the knowledge systems of non-literate peoples seriously? What was preserved in those oral traditions and ceremonial practices and landscape encodings that we have spent the past few centuries dismissing as primitive? What understanding of the world, of time, of the relationship between human beings and the places they inhabit was maintained by the people who lived at Devil's Tower for thousands of years, and that we are only now beginning to recover through the tools of modern science? The answer, insofar as the evidence can provide it, is more than we thought, far more. Enough to require a genuine revision of how we understand the history of human knowledge and the capacity of human cultures that operated without writing. That revision is happening. It is happening here, in the work being done at Devil's Tower and at dozens of comparable sites around the world. It is happening in the collaboration between scientific researchers and indigenous knowledge keepers. It is happening in the slow but accelerating shift of consensus in archaeology and anthropology and archaeoastronomy. It is happening in the realization that the story we were told about who was here and what they knew was not just incomplete, but fundamentally misleading. And as it happens, it changes something not just about our understanding of the past, but about our relationship to the present, to the land we live on, to the people who lived on it before us, to the knowledge systems they maintained and the places they considered sacred, and the long conversation they conducted with the world around them across timescales that dwarf everything we call history. Devil's Tower is a rock, but it is also a key to a longer, deeper, truer understanding of what it means to be human in the Americas, on this continent, in this landscape, across all the time that human beings have been here. We are still learning to turn it. The story continues. There are geologists who have spent their entire careers studying formations like Devil's Tower, moving from site to site, comparing one igneous intrusion to another, building up the kind of comprehensive, comparative understanding that only comes from decades of fieldwork. When those geologists visit Devil's Tower for the first time, or when they return after years away, they often report an experience that is not quite like what they expected from a geological site. The tower is, of course, exactly what the science says it is. The columns are phonolite porphyry. The formation is an igneous intrusion. The geological story is real and well documented. But the experience of being at the site exceeds what the geological description prepares you for. Part of this is simply the visual impact. Photographs of Devil's Tower are numerous and accessible, but they do not convey the scale or the proportion or the impossible rightness of the tower's geometry in relation to the surrounding landscape. The columns, which look merely regular in photographs, look at close range like they were designed. Not built, exactly, but designed. As if some intelligence was expressed in the cooling of the rock, as if the mathematical precision of the hexagonal geometry was not the product of chance thermodynamics, but of intention. This is not a rational response to the geological evidence. The geological evidence says clearly that hexagonal columnar jointing is a natural product of specific cooling conditions, and the evidence is correct. But the rational mind and the perceptual mind are not always in alignment, and at Devil's Tower, the perceptual mind tends to overrule the rational mind with a persistence that suggests something significant is happening in the encounter between human perception and this particular arrangement of matter in space. The researchers who have been trying to understand why this happens, why the tower produces this consistent overriding of rational expectation by direct perceptual response, I have found that the key factor is the mathematical precision of the columnar geometry relative to human cognitive baselines. Human brains have evolved to distinguish between natural and artificial patterns. Patterns that exceed a certain threshold of regularity are classified by the perceptual system as artifact, as the product of intelligence rather than chance. The threshold is calibrated to the range of patterns found in the natural environments in which human brains evolved. Devil's Tower falls outside that range. The precision of its hexagonal columns exceeds what human baseline calibration expects from natural processes. The perceptual system therefore registers the tower at some level below conscious deliberation as artifact, as something made. This triggers the cognitive responses associated with encountering the products of intelligence: attention, curiosity, the search for meaning, the impulse to communicate with whoever made the thing. No one made Devil's Tower, but the perceptual system does not know this in the way that the rational mind knows it. The perceptual system keeps sending the signal: this looks designed, this looks intentional, this looks like something that wants to be understood. And that signal, repeated across every visit, across every generation of observers, has shaped the cultural response to the tower in ways that cannot be fully accounted for by any single historical or scientific explanation. The tower produces in human observers, by virtue of its unusual geometric precision, a cognitive state that is oriented toward meaning-making, toward the search for intelligence, toward communication with whatever the tower might represent. In that cognitive state, people ask questions, they make observations, they compare what they see to what they know. They try to connect the tower to the larger system of the world. And over time, those questions and observations and connections accumulate into a tradition of knowledge about the tower that reflects, in whatever form is available to the people doing the knowing, the real characteristics of the place. The native traditions that describe the tower as a place of connection between worlds are expressing, in a different vocabulary, the same cognitive reality that the modern researchers are documenting in different terms. The tower produces a state of mind that is oriented toward connection, toward the sense that the ordinary boundaries of experience are less fixed than usual, toward the perception that something is present here that is not present elsewhere. That state of mind, that perceptual mode, is where knowledge about the tower has always been generated, in people who were looking carefully, attending closely, taking seriously what they saw and heard and felt in the tower's presence. That is where the ancient astronomical traditions came from. That is where the oral traditions came from. That is where the scientific findings are coming from now. The tower is the same. The human cognitive response is the same. The knowledge is different in form and vocabulary and method. But the relationship between observer and observed, the sustained human attention to something that demands and rewards attention, is continuous, across all the time, that people have been standing at the base of Devil's Tower and asking what it is. The answer is still being assembled. It is larger and older and more complex than anyone expected. And every new piece that is added makes the picture richer and truer and more worth the sustained attention it has always commanded. Devil's Tower endures. The investigation deepens, the story grows, and the world, slowly, is beginning to understand what has been there all along. What does it mean to stand at a place where the boundary between geological time and human time becomes permeable? The question sounds philosophical. It is actually phenomenological, a description of what happens in the minds of people who visit Devil's Tower with genuine attention to its full depth. The geological time of the tower, 50 million years of formation and exposure and survival, is not something that can be comprehended in the ordinary sense. The number is too large, the scale too remote from ordinary experience to be understood as anything but an abstraction. And yet, standing at the base of the tower with awareness of that geological span, something in the mind stretches toward the comprehension even as it acknowledges the impossibility. That stretching, that cognitive reach toward a scale of time that exceeds ordinary comprehension, produces a specific and somewhat unusual mental state. A state in which the present moment feels simultaneously very small and very significant. Small because it is a point in a 50 million year story. Significant because it is the point at which that story is being witnessed, attended to, understood in whatever limited way the attending mind can manage. This state, which might be called temporal humility, is one of the gifts that places like Devil's Tower have to offer to the minds that encounter them honestly. It does not come from reading about the geology. It comes from being there, from the immediate perceptual impact of the tower in the landscape, modified by whatever knowledge the visitor brings. The people who have been visiting Devil's Tower for thousands of years, who built their cosmological frameworks around it, who maintained their ceremonial traditions there across generations and catastrophes and colonial disruptions, had access to that state in a way that is different from what casual visitors experience today. For them, the encounter with the tower was not a detour from ordinary life, but a central part of it. The tower was not a place you visited. It was a place you oriented around, a reference point in the literal and figurative landscape of existence. The depth of connection that comes from that kind of sustained orientation is not something that can be recovered quickly or easily by people who have grown up in a world organized around different reference points, but it can be approached. The research that is recovering the full story of Devil's Tower and the living traditions that never lost contact with that story are making it possible to approach it with more completeness than has been available for a long time. And in that approach, something becomes available that our culture has been missing for a while, a sense of place that goes beyond the merely geographical, a relationship with the land that is informed by its full history rather than only its recent past. A humility in the face of time that is not paralyzing but orienting, that says, this is very old, and you are a very recent part of it, and your task is to understand it as honestly as you can, and add your small contribution to the long project of understanding that has been going on here for much longer than you knew. That is what the scientists are doing at Devil's Tower, and that is what the people have always been doing there, in every generation, by whatever means were available to them. The tower stands, the work continues, the story endures. The research program at Devil's Tower is, in many ways, a model for how the investigation of ancient sacred sites can be conducted when it is done with the full range of available tools and the full commitment to taking the evidence seriously wherever it leads. Geological survey, archaeological excavation and dating, archaeoastronomical analysis, geophysical remote sensing, collaborative engagement with the oral traditions and ceremonial knowledge of the nations who maintain living relationship with the site. Each method illuminating what the others cannot see, each finding deepening the context for the others. The result is a picture of extraordinary complexity and richness. A site that has been important in ways we are still learning to articulate, a history that is longer and more sophisticated than our prior frameworks could accommodate, a knowledge tradition that has survived against odds that should have eliminated it, and a body of scientific evidence that, for all its detail and rigor, keeps pointing back to the same essential conclusion. The people who were here before us knew things we are only beginning to rediscover, and the places they considered sacred were sacred for reasons that go deeper than any single explanation can capture. That conclusion is where the investigation always arrives, at Devil's Tower and at the comparable sites around the world that the same methods are beginning to illuminate, not at a complete explanation, but at a deeper appreciation of the depth of what remains to be understood, not at certainty, but at a better quality of uncertainty, an uncertainty that is informed and contextual rather than blank and dismissive. The tower does not yield its full story easily. It does not need to. It has been here for 50 million years. It has time. The question is whether we do.